After 4,000 years in darkness, Lucas Trauman answered from inside his mind. He returned with every memory intact, but almost none of his original strength. The new body could barely hold mana, so even breathing became part of the recovery. At school, a bully expected the same helpless victim to walk back into class. Instead, Frey's fear finally turned into a warning nobody understood. A single movement left the bully unconscious and the academy searching for an explanation. Then Professor Kevin tried to expose him with a question about ancient history. Frey answered with knowledge no living student should have possessed. The name Kassajan forced an old friendship back into the present. And Lucas realized that this era had forgotten far more than his name. To reclaim his future, he would have to learn this weakened world from the inside. The story opens with a glimpse into the distant past, 4 millennia ago, where a brutal magical battle is already underway. A lone mage stands defiant against a swarm of monstrous entities, his presence alone commanding the battlefield. With a flick of his wrist, the mage summons a lethal forest of ice, instantly turning the tide against the encroaching horde. He systematically dismantles the opposition, his magic acting as both shield and executioner. As the pressure continues, the sheer disparity in power is evident. The mage remains pristine, while the horde lies decimated at his feet. The surviving creatures recoil in terror, unable to comprehend the existence of a human capable of such destruction. He steps forward, his voice calm yet heavy with authority, declaring his role as a guardian against the chaos they represent. As the pressure continues, he reveals his identity. Lucas Trauman, the pinnacle of human magical achievement, a 9-star great mage. At this point, Lucas offers a chillingly casual explanation for his intervention, framing his godlike power as a form of altruism. He dismisses the gravity of his actions with a flippant remark, underscoring his absolute dominance over the situation. Even so, Lucas responds by manifesting a colossal magic circle, a display of power that dwarfs anything the monsters have ever seen. He challenges them with a rhetorical question, his tone dripping with the certainty of a man who has already won. The sky itself seems to descend as a gargantuan magical construct obliterates the battlefield. As the pressure continues, the earth trembles under the weight of his spell, leaving nothing but dust and silence in its wake. With the final strike, the threat is extinguished, leaving Lucas as the sole figure standing in the ruins. As the pressure continues, he delivers a final stinging rebuke to the fallen, a testament to the potential of humanity that they failed. A new, enigmatic presence emerges, unimpressed by Lucas's display of power. Before he can react, Lucas is ensnared by a sudden, powerful magical trap. The trap takes hold, and for the first time, the great mage finds himself on the defensive. As the pressure continues, the magical restraints tighten, inflicting searing pain that even his immense power cannot easily deflect. The true masters of the world reveal themselves, standing over the weakened mage. Even in defeat, Lucas refuses to bow, his defiance a final act of rebellion against his captors. The demigod issues a final warning, but Lucas meets the threat with open mockery, refusing to submit to the entity's divine posturing. The demigod dismisses Lucas's achievements, reducing his entire existence to a mere mortal status that must be corrected. The demigod takes physical action, using shadowy appendages to seize Lucas and suppress his resistance. As a result, stripped of his primary weapon, Lucas experiences the terrifying sensation of being rendered powerless. The demigod frames Lucas's rebellion as a fundamental transgression, setting the stage for his ultimate punishment. As the pressure continues, the demigod initiates a ritual of containment, marking Lucas as a sinner to be erased. The demigod delivers a cruel sentence, promising to break Lucas's mind by trapping him in a cycle of endless, agonizing doubt. With a final, cold decree, the demigod seals Lucas's fate, consigning him to a state of perpetual regret. The demigod's power completely overwhelms Lucas, leaving him helpless as the final stage of his punishment begins. The narrative jumps to the present, where a battered young man finds himself in a new, harsh reality. As the pressure continues, the boy is confronted by bullies who immediately target his social standing and lack of wealth. The bully continues to belittle the boy, emphasizing his perceived inferiority within his own family. The physical intimidation escalates as the bully toys with his victim. The boy's reputation as a failure is reinforced by the onlookers. The bully mocks the boy's resilience, turning it into another point of ridicule. The bully's cruelty knows no bounds, as he suggests the boy should have died already. The boy's spirit appears to be completely crushed under the weight of the abuse. The bully shares a moment of cruel camaraderie with his friends. The bully's frustration with the boy's persistence is evident. The bully finds a twisted pleasure in the act of tormenting the boy. The physical assault continues, with the bully showing no mercy. As the pressure continues, the bully reveals the depth of his sadism, finding the abuse to be a source of personal satisfaction. The relentless assault continues, with the other bullies watching on. The cycle of violence shows no sign of stopping. The bully's dominance is absolute, and the boy is completely at his mercy. As the pressure continues, the boy suffers another brutal blow, his resistance fading under the constant barrage. The two bullies continue their assault, kicking and stomping on the defenseless boy who lies curled on the ground. The boy's face shows him in a state of extreme distress, his eyes squeezed shut and his mouth open in a silent cry. As the pressure continues, the boy, still on the ground, desperately pleads for the bullies to stop. One of the bullies delivers another brutal kick to the boy's head, showing no mercy. The bully stands over the boy, looming large and intimidating. The bully leans in close, his face twisted into a menacing grin, as he informs the boy that, as the pressure continues, the bully mocks the boy, sarcastically promising to be gentle while his tone remains threatening. The bully continues his threats, promising to make the next day unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. The bullies call back to the boy, telling him to go home and rest so he can be. The boy's hand clenches into a fist, shaking with a mix of pain, fear, and a burgeoning, desperate rage. As the pressure continues, the boy lies alone in the dark, his body broken and his spirit crushed. The boy's internal monologue shifts, a singular, powerful desire forming amidst his despair. As the pressure continues, the boy experiences a surreal, nightmarish vision. As the pressure continues, the boy questions if he is hallucinating, his mind struggling to process the bizarre. The boy accepts his potential descent into madness, standing in a surreal, crystalline landscape, a hand being restrained by dark, shadowy, clawed hands. At this point, Frey's face appears in profile, looking exhausted and distressed, a desolate, ruined landscape under a dark, swirling sky. Then, Frey appears struggling, surrounded by dark, shadowy entities that are pinning him down. Even so, Frey's face, his eyes wide with shock and realization as he reacts to something off-screen. Meanwhile, Frey is kneeling before a man sitting on a throne in a grand hall. He declares that he can no longer overlook the shame brought upon the family's honor. As a result, Frey's face, showing a mix of pain, resignation, and lingering shock. Then, Frey's face, looking down in defeat. Even so, Frey remains kneeling before his father, questioning if being weak is truly a sin. The father stands up, looking imposing and angry, telling Frey that he is not permitted to ask such questions. As the pressure continues, the father walks away, his boots clicking on the floor. The father calls out to Frey, who looks up with a pained expression. The father stands over the kneeling Frey, coldly stating that Frey has never existed in his life and that he has never appeared, an eye welling up with tears, capturing the emotional impact of the father's rejection. Meanwhile, Frey is crying as he watches his father walk away into the distance. An exterior shot of a building at night, identified as Frey's house. A desk with books, a pen, a bottle, and a framed picture of a young man. Then Frey stands in his room, holding a bottle, looking lost and contemplative. Even so, Frey looks at the bottle in his hands, the word suicide appearing in a thought bubble. Meanwhile, Frey's hands trembling as he grips the bottle. At this point, Frey's face appears, his expression one of terror as he contemplates death. As a result, Frey is back in the dark, shadowy realm, being held by the entities. Then, Frey's face, looking exhausted and hopeless, as the entities continue to torment him. An eye, wide and filled with fear. A shadowy, hooded figure with glowing blue eyes speaks to Frey, telling him he will eventually doubt his own existence. At this point, Frey screams in frustration and anger, his mouth wide open. As a result, Frey is surrounded by the shadowy hands, shouting at the entities questioning the nature of God, order, and laws in. Then, Frey's face appears in a tight close-up, his teeth gritted in intense determination. Even so, Frey, his eyes glowing with a fierce blue light, screams in defiance. Meanwhile, Frey appears in a state of physical agony, coughing up blood while his hands reach out desperately. An extreme close-up of Frey's wide, terrified eye. As a result, Frey is pinned down by multiple shadowy, clawed hands. Then, Frey is on his knees, blood pooling on the ground before him, a hand reaching out against a blood-splattered surface. Meanwhile, Frey is restrained by shadowy hands, his expression one of confusion and alarm. At this point, Frey's eye, which is wide and trembling, reflecting a sudden shift in his internal state. As a result, Frey is still held by the shadowy hands. Then, Frey is hunched over, his face obscured by shadow, consumed by self-blame and despair. He laments that he was born without wings, a metaphor for his perceived lack of potential or power. Meanwhile, Frey's hair appears in motion as he continues to spiral into self-loathing, blaming himself for his inability to grow stronger. At this point, Frey appears falling or being cast aside, his body limp. A group of faceless, shadowy figures stand over Frey, mocking him. The faceless figures continue to ridicule Frey, labeling him the disgrace of Westrod Academy. A young man with a cruel expression reaches out toward the camera, telling Frey to drop dead. The speaker tells Frey that if they were in his position, they would have died long ago. At this point, Frey lies on the ground, surrounded by the mocking, faceless crowd. As a result, above him, a powerful, muscular, and winged figure looms, looking down at him. The muscular, winged figure stands over Frey, who is still being held by the shadowy hands. As the pressure continues, the winged figure is now fully visible, standing over the restrained Frey. Meanwhile, Frey lies on the ground, his consciousness shifting. At this point, Frey's face as he lies on the ground, his expression softening as he experiences the warmth. The winged figure kneels beside the fallen Frey, reaching out to touch his head. As the pressure continues, the winged figure's hand resting gently on Frey's head, a stark contrast to the previous hostility. Even so, Frey's eye, now filled with a different emotion, as he contemplates the possibility of being reborn. Meanwhile, Frey's eye, a single tear rolling down his cheek as he continues his internal monologue. At this point, Frey imagines himself leaping into the sky, flying to the highest place in existence to look down upon the world. The powerful winged figure stands tall, looking down with glowing eyes, embodying the strength and freedom Frey desires. Then, Frey's face, showing his eyes wide with shock and realization. Even so, Frey is seen from behind, kneeling on the floor in a dimly lit room. Meanwhile, Frey looks up, his expression one of disbelief and confusion. A tight close-up of Frey's eyes, which are now glowing with a faint, ethereal blue light. As a result, Frey stands up fully, his posture now confident and composed. He looks like a completely different person, his posture radiating authority. A glowing magical seal is visible on the wall, pulsing with light. As the pressure continues, a discarded medicine bottle lies on the floor, surrounded by spilled pills. At this point, Frey ties his hair back, his expression calm and determined. As a result, Frey walks across the room, his steps rhythmic and purposeful. Then, Frey stands before a large window, looking out into the night. Even so, Frey throws open the curtains, revealing the night sky. Meanwhile, Frey reaches out to the window frame, his hand resting against the glass. At this point, Frey's profile as he gazes at the moon. As a result, Frey points a finger toward the moon, his expression hardening. Then, Frey continues to point toward the sky, his gaze unwavering. A final close-up of Frey, his eyes glowing with power. Frey stands in the center of a clearing, surrounded by a faint, glowing blue aura of mana. As the pressure continues, Frey, his expression intense and focused as he channels mana. As a result, Frey's face appears in a close-up, his eyes closed in deep concentration. Then, Frey continues his training in the clearing. Even so, Frey's face, his teeth gritted in pain or extreme effort as he pushes his body to the limit to absorb mana. A dark, ominous silhouette looms in the background, representing the demigod. As the pressure continues, a menacing shadowy figure with glowing red eyes and a sharp toothy grin appears, representing the overwhelming ambition and, as a result, Frey reaches out with his hand, surrounded by dark, swirling energy and floating red eyes. Then, Frey stands amidst the swirling dark energy, his form silhouetted against the blue mana. Even so, Frey looks down at his hand, which is glowing with blue mana. Meanwhile, Frey's face, his eyes closed as he calms his breathing. The story shifts to a peaceful night sky with a full moon. As a result, Frey stands in the morning light, his posture relaxed but alert. An extreme close-up of Frey's eye, which is tightly shut. Even so, Frey's eye snaps open, glowing with a brilliant, concentrated blue light. Meanwhile, Frey stands in the clearing, his body surrounded by a powerful, surging blue aura. At this point, Frey stands in the clearing, the blue aura around him beginning to stabilize. As a result, Frey's eye, which widens in sudden realization or pain. Then, Frey suddenly coughs, his body reacting violently as he expels something from his system. A dark, viscous black substance splatters onto the ground as Frey continues to cough, his body purging impurities. Meanwhile, Frey is hunched over on the ground, breathing heavily. At this point, Frey's face, his mouth stained with the black substance. As a result, Frey's jaw is clenched, his face contorted in effort as he prepares to purge the rest of the impurities from. Then, Frey screams in exertion as he releases a massive burst of blue mana, forcing the last of the impurities out of his body. Even so, Frey stands in the center of a massive, swirling vortex of blue mana, his body finally being cleansed of all impurities. A student named Jack approaches another student named David, asking why he is at the academy so early. At this point, David's face as he smiles, confirming his excitement for the upcoming class. As a result, two students in the academy canteen discuss Frey. The larger student continues the conversation, mentioning he saw Frey at the infirmary the previous day and noted he had many sleeping pills. As the pressure continues, the students speculate that Frey was planning to commit suicide because of the bullying. Meanwhile, Frey appears in a state of intense physical release, surrounded by a massive, swirling vortex of blue mana as he purges the impurities. At this point, Frey is hunched over, breathing heavily and sweating profusely. As a result, Frey's eyes as he realizes the significance of what he has just achieved. Then, Frey stands alone in the aftermath of the purge, looking at the mess on the ground and questioning if all of that was. Even so, Frey's face, showing him looking calm but exhausted, with remnants of the black substance still on his mouth. Meanwhile, Frey is seen from behind, looking toward the academy building, the Westrod Academy trainee canteen, where students are gathered for a meal. As a result, students in the canteen whisper and look toward Frey, who has entered the room and is drawing attention to himself. Then, Frey sits at a table and begins eating ravenously, piling up empty plates as he consumes food at an incredible speed, shocking the. Even so, Frey continues to eat with intense focus, clearly enjoying the food and commenting on how delicious the soup is. Meanwhile, Frey reflects on his hunger, noting that since he hasn't eaten in 4,000 years, everything tastes amazing to him. At this point, other students watch Frey, whispering to each other and wondering if the person eating so voraciously is truly Frey Blake. As a result, Frey's face, showing him deep in thought as he contemplates his current situation. Then, Frey walks through the academy halls, feeling out of place as he considers the age gap between his true self and the students. Even so, Frey acknowledges that he has no choice but to adapt, as he cannot bridge the 4,000-year knowledge gap on his own. Meanwhile, 4,000 years later, the legendary Mage wakes inside a broken young body. A dark, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes looms over Frey, who is seen from behind as he walks down a hallway. As a result, Frey's expression is calm and composed as he contemplates his next steps, showing a hint of a smile. Then, Frey reminds himself not to rush his plans, maintaining his focus. Even so, Frey opens a door, stepping into a room where other students are gathered. Meanwhile, Frey walks into the room, drawing the attention of the students inside. The students in the room look at Frey with annoyance and hostility. As the pressure continues, the student who previously bet on Frey's suicide, looking at him with disdain. The student is visibly angry, slamming his hand on the table and complaining about losing the bet because Frey didn't commit suicide. Even so, Frey stands calmly, looking at the angry student with a questioning expression, unfazed by the hostility. Meanwhile, Frey's eyes narrow as he prepares to face the hostile students, his gaze sharp and calculating. One of the students steps forward, his posture radiating aggression as he closes the distance. As a result, Frey remains unfazed, standing tall while the student with orange hair lounges in his chair, clearly looking for a fight. The student sneers at Frey, his words dripping with sarcasm as he attempts to intimidate the newcomer. Frey stares with wide, intense eyes, his expression one of sudden, sharp realization or shock. A man with reddish hair and a sharp, predatory gaze. As a result, Frey looks up, his eyes narrowing as he is addressed by the bully. The large, imposing bully, Jack, looms over Frey, grabbing him by the head and demanding lunch tickets. Even so, Jack continues to harass Frey, hitting him on the head while complaining about lost tickets. A tight close-up on Jack's face, showing his aggressive, distorted expression. As the pressure continues, a sharp, focused shot of Frey's eye, glowing with a faint, magical intensity. As a result, Jack grabs Frey's chin, but he suddenly notices something strange. Then, Frey looks at his own hand, confused by his reaction. Even so, Jack's mouth appears in a close-up, drooling and shouting demandingly for his tickets, completely oblivious to the shift in the atmosphere. Meanwhile, Frey calmly reaches up and grabs Jack's hand, stopping the harassment. A flash of magical energy erupts, signaling that Frey has begun to retaliate with force. As a result, Jack is sent flying backward by an unseen force, his face contorted in shock. Then, Frey's eyes, now glowing with a distinct, powerful red light. Even so, students in the background watch in stunned silence, whispering to each other about how Frey suddenly moved and sent Jack flying. At this point, Frey stands tall, looking down at the bullies with a cold, knowing expression. As a result, Jack scowls, his face showing frustration and anger as he tries to regain his composure. Even so, Jack swings his hand in a powerful strike, aiming to hit Frey again. Meanwhile, Frey channels a burst of magical energy into his arm, preparing to counter the attack with overwhelming force. At this point, Frey moves with incredible speed, his body blurring as he executes a precise, powerful strike. As a result, Jack is launched into the air by the impact, his body spinning as he loses all control. Then, Jack crashes into the classroom furniture, sending chairs and books flying in a chaotic display of force. Even so, Jack lies on the floor, defeated and unconscious, surrounded by the debris of the classroom. Meanwhile, Jack's face, showing blood trickling from a cut. At this point, Frey stands over the fallen Jack, looking down at him with a calm, indifferent expression. Then, Frey stands in the center of the room, his expression unreadable as he surveys the aftermath of the fight. Even so, Frey struggles with the dissonance between his legendary past and his current, youthful vessel. At this point, Frey's departure is marked by the lingering tension of his victory. The students struggle to process the reality of the fight. As the pressure continues, the student's perception of Frey is shattered by his unexpected strength. The classroom is filled with murmurs of disbelief. As the pressure continues, the arrival of a new figure interrupts the chaos. As a result, Professor Dio stands in the room, looking composed and authoritative. Then, Dio assesses the situation, his eyes narrowing as he examines the fallen student. Meanwhile, Dio discovers evidence of a skill that shouldn't be possible for a student. The discovery of mana-infused martial arts confirms that Frey is far more than he appears. Then, Dio's professional judgment is shaken by the level of skill displayed. Even so, Professor Dio looks around the room, his gaze sweeping over the students. Meanwhile, Professor Kevin attempts to restore order to the classroom. At this point, Professor Kevin looks at the students, his expression somewhat lecherous. As a result, Professor Kevin continues to look at the students, his expression unchanged. Then, Kevin's true nature is revealed, much to the students' disgust. Even so, Kevin's unwanted attention toward Isabel makes the situation even worse. The students are trapped in an uncomfortable class. As a result, Frey remains detached from the classroom drama. The students share their mutual disdain for the professor. Meanwhile, Kevin confronts Frey, drawing attention to his uncharacteristic behavior. At this point, Professor Kevin looks at Frey, his expression curious. Then, Kevin's frustration with Frey grows as he fails to get a reaction. Even so, Frey sits at his desk with a calm, polite smile, hands pressed together in a gesture of mock deference. At this point, Professor Kevin stands before the class, his expression smug and condescending. As a result, Frey maintains his composed, slightly amused expression. Even so, Professor Kevin, seen from behind, repeats Frey's words with a tone of annoyance, clearly struggling to maintain his composure as the professor's face contorts with visible rage, a vein pulsing on his forehead. As the pressure continues, the professor shifts his focus to testing Frey, demanding to know if he has been keeping up with the curriculum. A female student sits nearby, looking concerned as the professor announces he will give Frey a quick quiz to test his knowledge. Then, Professor Kevin looms over Frey, his expression malicious. Meanwhile, Professor Kevin asks Frey to name 3 items used by the legendary magic warrior King Kasajin, clearly intending to stump him with an. At this point, Frey's eye shows a sudden, sharp shift in his expression. As a result, Frey looks up at the professor, his demeanor having shifted from indifferent to intensely focused. Then, Frey stares directly at the professor, his eyes wide and serious. The story shifts back in time to a remote mountain range 4,000 years in the past. A lone warrior stands at the precipice of a cliff, his powerful physique suggesting a life of intense discipline. His back is a map of scars and muscle, marked by strange, rope-like accessories that hint at his specific martial path. He channels his internal energy, his hand igniting with a brilliant, golden light as he prepares to strike. With a sharp shout, he focuses his entire strength into a single, glowing fist. He assumes a combat stance, his aura flaring outward with such intensity that the very air around him trembles. As the pressure continues, he throws a punch, and the resulting shockwave tears through the mountain air like a physical force. The energy blast impacts the mountain face, shattering rock and earth with overwhelming power. As the pressure continues, the mountain trembles under the force of the strike, the landscape being reshaped by his sheer martial might. The impact leaves a deep, jagged scar across the mountain, a testament to his destructive capability. As the dust settles, the sheer scale of the devastation becomes clear. He stands amidst the wreckage, his expression unmoved by the cataclysmic power he just unleashed. A newcomer arrives, chiding the warrior for his reckless display of strength and the damage caused to the local ecosystem. The warrior recognizes the visitor, his stoic expression softening slightly as he addresses him. As the pressure continues, the two men greet each other, the weight of years between them evident in their exchange. At this point, Kasajin resumes his relentless training, seemingly unable to stop even with a guest present. Then, Kasajin offers a simple gesture of hospitality, though he doesn't break his focus. Even so, Lucas sips his tea, mocking Kasajin's single-minded devotion to his martial arts. The conversation turns to personal matters, with Lucas becoming defensive about his own life. As a result, Kasajin dismisses the topic of love, viewing it as a distraction from his martial discipline. Meanwhile, Lucas challenges Kasajin's worldview, drawing a comparison to his own life as a mage. As a result, Lucas watches his friend, waiting to see how he will respond to the challenge. In a classroom, a student is slumped over their desk, head down, while a professor stands at the front. The professor continues to taunt the student, asking why they cannot answer his question. Even so, Isabel stands up in the classroom, interrupting the professor, Kevin, to challenge the relevance of his question. Meanwhile, Isabel continues her argument, stating that the professor's question is not related to the history of magecraft curriculum. A student reacts with shock, noting that, despite Isabel's pretty appearance, she speaks with the bluntness of a soldier. Meanwhile, Isabel continues her explanation, asserting that Kasajin was a martial artist who used mana only to enhance his body and therefore should not. As a result, Professor Kevin walks down the stairs toward Isabel, his expression stern as he questions her assertion that Kasajin was not. The professor looms over Isabel, asking if she is insulting all the practitioners who train in magic warrior techniques. Meanwhile, Isabel remains calm, stating that she simply believes the professor's interpretation is incorrect. A vision of Kasajin appears surrounded by a golden aura shouting that he is a martial artist and not a magician, and asking. The professor grabs Isabel by the shoulders, suggesting they continue their debate in his laboratory, just the two of them. As a result, Isabel recoils, holding up a hand to stop the professor, clearly uncomfortable with his physical advance. As the pressure continues, the professor expresses his disapproval, stating he did not think Isabel would be this disrespectful. The professor challenges Isabel to answer the question herself, listing the 3 items used by the magic warrior king, Kasajin. Even so, Isabel sits at her desk, leaning back with her hands behind her head, looking relaxed and confident. As a result, Isabel continues to mutter to herself, criticizing Kasajin's lack of fashion sense and specifically mentioning his old-fashioned necklace. Then, Isabel's face, as she pauses, looking slightly confused or surprised by her own realization. The classroom, showing the students seated at their desks. As the pressure continues, the professor's face, looking stern and serious as he confirms that Isabel is correct. Even so, Isabel celebrates her correct answer, raising her fist in the air with a triumphant expression. As the pressure continues, the professor stands over Isabel, telling her that he believes she lacks respect and manners. The professor's hand grabbing Isabel's arm, showing his aggressive behavior. As the pressure continues, the professor demands that Isabel follow him to his laboratory immediately, his expression menacing. Meanwhile, Isabel's face, showing her looking shocked and teary-eyed, clearly distressed by the professor's actions. As a result, Frey stands up and addresses the professor, asking if he knows the saying that the magic warrior king Kasajin used. Then, Frey quotes Kasajin, stating that feelings of love and affection are evil thoughts that can perturb a martial artist's composure. Even so, Frey continues the quote, saying that martial artists must see women as mere rocks, and that those who fall to their... As the pressure continues, the professor asks Frey what he is trying to say, and Frey replies that he was just repeating the quote. As a result, Frey continues, saying he was thinking that maybe Kasajin was wrong, seeing how the professor is standing perfectly on his feet. The professor's face, showing him looking angry and frustrated. The students in the classroom are shocked and whisper to each other, calling out Frey's name. The professor's face, looking furious and sweating. Even so, did you lose your mind after answering one question correctly? The professor points at Frey, threatening him and telling him to see how long he can keep up his attitude. The professor reiterates his threat, stating that if Frey gets even a single question wrong, he will take responsibility as a trainee of. Meanwhile, Frey looks at the professor with a calm and confident expression, simply saying next question. The professor is visibly shaken, his composure shattered by an unforeseen event. The students are left reeling, their expectations completely upended. Then, Isabel watches the scene unfold, her expression betraying her internal turmoil. Even so, Frey remains unfazed, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos he has caused. Meanwhile, Frey has successfully answered every question, leaving the professor in a state of total bewilderment. The professor is struggling to comprehend how a student could possess such deep, obscure historical knowledge. As a result, Frey casually dismisses the tension, his mind already on his next meal. Then, Frey addresses the professor, his tone calm and direct. Even so, Frey dismisses the quiz as a mere triviality, his hunger taking precedence. The professor is deeply unsettled by Frey's profound knowledge of ancient history. At this point, Frey's calm demeanor only serves to further unsettle the professor. The professor is clearly struggling to maintain his composure. Even so, Frey leaves the classroom, his focus entirely on his lunch. The professor remains in a state of shock, unable to move on. As a result, Isabel observes Frey, her curiosity piqued by his mysterious behavior. Even so, Isabel attempts to engage Frey in conversation. Meanwhile, Frey's face and profile, his expression neutral and slightly distant. As a result, Isabel is shocked that Frey would ignore her. Then, Isabel is left to ponder Frey's strange behavior. Meanwhile, Isabel continues to follow Frey, her persistence evident. At this point, Isabel continues to trail Frey, her curiosity driving her forward. As a result, Frey finally confronts Isabel about her persistent following. Then, Frey demands to know why Isabel is following him, only to be met with a simple, logical explanation. Even so, Frey and Isabel continue their tense interaction in a public space, a table filled with a large, elaborate feast. At this point, Isabel stares in shock at the massive amount of food, questioning if Frey truly intends to eat it all by himself. As a result, Frey sits at a table, calmly eating while Isabel watches him. Then, Frey continues eating, dismissively telling Isabel there is no need for her to know about his past. Even so, Isabel, flustered, tries to justify her presence by claiming there were simply no other empty seats in the cafeteria. At this point, Isabel explains that the Light Ages refers to the era 4000 years ago, when the four great masters were. As a result, Frey chewing his food, his expression thoughtful and slightly cynical as he processes the information about the current state of magecraft. Even so, Frey looks at Isabel, contemplating the possibility that a demigod intervened to cause this regression in magical knowledge. Meanwhile, Frey's face, his eyes narrowed in deep thought as he considers the potential involvement of a demigod in the history of the world. A flashback or historical reference showing the four great masters, the magic warrior King Kasajin and the great sage Schweizer Wilseman. The historical reference continues, showing the Black Witch Iris Fissfounder and the strongest mage, Lucas Trauman, whom Isabel aspires to rival. Even so, Frey, who is revealed to be Lucas Trauman. Meanwhile, Isabel continues to speak about Lucas, praising him as an incredible master and admitting that if he were still alive, she would have. At this point, Isabel finishes her sentence, stating she would have asked for his hand in marriage. Then, Frey laughs heartily, mocking the idea of a young girl talking about marriage. Even so, Frey dismisses Isabel's feelings, stating he is not interested in children. At this point, two students discuss how Isabel was seen chasing after Frey earlier, expressing their disbelief. The students are shocked that the proud Isabel, one of the academy's top students, would be the one chasing after someone. Even so, David, the student mentioned, overhears the gossip and is clearly offended, stammering a weak defense. Meanwhile, David looks on with a stern expression as the other students quickly scurry away, clearly intimidated by his presence. As a result, David watches the scene from afar, clearly annoyed by the attention Frey is receiving and the general situation. Then, Frey continues their conversation while cutting his food, referencing a specific question posed by Professor Kevin. Meanwhile, Frey mentions the 3 training methods of Schweitzer, while Isabel listens intently, clearly curious about the topic. At this point, Isabel continues to listen as Frey explains that she previously answered with assimilation, amplification, and battling. Then, Frey places his hand on the table, signaling a shift in the conversation as he prepares to address the 3rd method. Even so, Isabel asks Frey for the honor of teaching her the battling method he mentioned, showing her eagerness to learn. At this point, Isabel confidently replies that she is a competent 3-star mage. As a result, Frey acknowledges her talent, noting that being a 3-star at her age is impressive. Then, Isabel observes Frey closely, remarking that he speaks like someone who has lived for a very long time. Even so, Frey admits that he has lived for a long time, far too long, with a weary expression. Meanwhile, Isabel is confused by his statement and asks if he is not the same age as her, while Frey continues to eat. As a result, Frey announces he is stuffed, and Isabel is shocked that he finished everything so quickly. Even so, Isabel stops him, insisting that he has not answered her question about what the battling method is. Meanwhile, Frey explains that the method is not about reading books, but about experience, which makes his answer potentially biased. As a result, Isabel repeats his words in disbelief, struggling to comprehend the depth of his experience. Then, Isabel's eye shows her intense focus and growing suspicion about Frey's true identity. Even so, Frey walks away with the stack of plates, leaving Isabel behind, questioning who he really is. A large, curved outdoor training arena where students are gathered for a practical magic class. As a result, David, the orange-haired student, looking confident and arrogant as he prepares for the upcoming matches. A tight close-up of David's face, showing a focused, slightly aggressive expression as he anticipates the fight. Even so, Isabel sits on the steps next to Frey, who has long gray hair. A female professor with long dark hair stands at a podium, addressing the students. Then, Frey, blushing slightly, comments that the professor is gorgeous, which catches Isabel off guard. Even so, Isabel is shocked and scolds Frey, pointing out that the professor is in her 40s and questioning his sanity. The professor stands confidently, looking down at the students. The professor announces the first match between David and Frey in the center of the arena. Even so, Frey's face, showing a calm, composed expression as he prepares to step into the arena. As a result, David approaches Frey, taunting him and saying that the weight has been torturing him. Meanwhile, Frey walks past David, heading toward the professor, who watches them from the sidelines. At this point, Frey suddenly approaches the professor and dips her in a dramatic, romantic gesture, shocking the onlookers. As a result, Frey holds the professor in a dip, declaring that he has realized why he opened his eyes after his eternal. The professor looks flustered and confused, asking Frey what he is talking about. Meanwhile, Frey leans in close to the professor, asking her to dinner, while she looks completely overwhelmed. The professor, still in the dip, tells Frey to return to his position, clearly flustered by his bold move. As a result, Frey makes a bet with the professor. If he wins the match, she must go to dinner with him. Even so, David, standing nearby, looks at Frey with disdain, mocking his ability to win against him. Meanwhile, Professor Jane, looking slightly flustered and caught off guard, agrees to the bet. At this point, Frey acknowledges the agreement with a calm, confident expression, confirming that it is a promise. Even so, Frey, now alone, questions his own actions. At this point, David confronts Frey, looking down at him with an aggressive and mocking stance, questioning if Frey has lost his mind. Even so, David continues to taunt Frey, suggesting that perhaps Frey asked the professor to cancel the match out of fear. At this point, David mocks Frey for his apparent lack of awareness regarding his dire situation, while Frey remains stoic. As a result, David drops the pretense, threatening to destroy Frey's vocal cords as the first step in his brutal plan. Then, David continues his graphic threats, promising to break Frey's limbs one by one, so he cannot even cry out for help while Frey. Even so, David points a finger at Frey, reiterating his promise that today will be the last day Frey walks properly. Meanwhile, Frey's eyes glow with a faint, intense purple light, signaling his shift into a more serious, magical state. Then, Professor Jane officially announces the start of the match, her expression serious and focused. Meanwhile, David immediately casts a spell, calling out Stone Rage as he prepares to attack. A massive, jagged stone construct forms in the air, controlled by David, as he prepares to launch it at Frey. The onlookers are shocked and horrified, recognizing the spell as Stone Rage and questioning how David is allowed. As the pressure continues, a student confronts Professor Jane, demanding to know how David is using a spell beyond the one-star limit. As a result, Professor Jane looks on with a calm, analytical expression, stating that David has not broken the rules. Even so, David reveals that the spell is a unique ability passed down through his family known as vision magic, which allows him. The massive stone construct created by David's Stone Rage spell hangs in the air, crackling with magical energy. As a result, David floats in the air, maintaining his control over the stone construct. Then, David, looking smug and confident, gestures toward the floating stone debris, asking Frey if he is scared of the impending attack. Even so, Frey remains calm and unimpressed, gesturing dismissively with his hand as he replies that he is not scared at all. Even so, Frey calmly summons a small glowing orb of energy in his palm, identifying it as a simple magic missile spell. The surrounding students watch the confrontation with expressions of intense anxiety and disbelief, clearly worried about the outcome of the duel. A female student watches the scene with wide, teary eyes, her expression one of pure shock and fear as she witnesses the power. Then, Frey stands composed, holding the small glowing magic missile in his hand, while the onlookers observe him with concern. Even so, David bursts into mocking laughter, finding it hilarious that Frey intends to counter his powerful Stone Rage with such a basic. The scene shows the contrast between David's massive destructive spell and Frey's tiny orb of light. At this point, Frey clenches his hand into a fist, focusing his energy into the magic missile, preparing to launch it. As a result, Frey extends his finger, aiming the concentrated energy of the magic missile directly at the incoming threat. The stone debris from David's spell begins to fall, but Frey's attack is already in motion, cutting through the air. A thin, piercing beam of light shoots forward, effortlessly slicing through the heavy stone debris as if it were nothing. The beam of light continues its trajectory, striking with immense force and precision, shattering the remaining obstacles in its path. As the pressure continues, the magic missile strikes David directly, the impact creating a blinding flash of energy that overwhelms the arena. Meanwhile, David is caught completely off guard, his expression shifting from arrogance to sheer terror as the spell hits him. The force of the impact sends David flying backward, his body contorted by the sudden, overwhelming power of the strike. Then, David is struck squarely in the chest by the concentrated energy, his body reeling from the direct hit. Even so, David is launched through the air, completely defeated by the single, precise strike from Frey's basic spell. Meanwhile, David lies motionless on the ground, defeated and trembling, while the debris from his own spell settles around him. A group of students watches in shock and horror as a brutal scene unfolds before them. A female student with red hair watches with a look of pure terror, her mouth agape as she witnesses the unfolding cruelty. Then, Professor Jane observes the scene with a calm, detached expression, her hand resting near her chin. Even so, Frey stands tall and composed, looking down at his opponent with a cold, indifferent gaze. The opponent lies on the ground, gasping and choking as he clutches his throat. As the pressure continues, the opponent's face shows him weeping in desperation, his eyes wide with panic as he realizes he has lost. As a result, Frey stands over the fallen opponent in the center of the arena, surrounded by debris. Then, two students stand nearby, observing the fight with concern. At this point, Frey looms over the struggling opponent, criticizing his poor use of vision magic and his failure to uphold his family name. Then, Frey smiles cruelly, taunting the opponent about his previous threats and the consequences of his actions. Even so, Frey conjures a glowing orb of magic in his hand, his expression calm and menacing as he recalls the opponent's words. Meanwhile, Frey holds the magical orb, threatening the opponent with further physical harm, specifically mentioning breaking his limbs. As the pressure continues, the opponent, now desperate, begs for mercy, apologizing for his actions while Frey stands. Even so, Frey flicks his finger, releasing a sharp, magical projectile that strikes the opponent. The opponent is struck by the magical attack, recoiling in pain as the impact creates a burst of energy. Then, Frey looks down at the opponent with a mocking smile, questioning if he is feeling unwell after his own plan backfired. As the pressure continues, the opponent, defeated and broken, reaches out toward Frey, who stands over him with an air of cold superiority. The red-haired student calls out to Professor Jane, pleading for her to stop the match, but Jane remains unmoved. Even so, Frey stands over the defeated opponent, delivering a final cold lesson about the reality of battle. As the pressure continues, the red-haired student's eye, capturing her intense focus and the emotional impact of Frey's overwhelming display of magical dominance. Even so, Frey taunts the defeated student, who lies on the ground in agony and covered in saliva, pointing out the irony that, at this point, Frey coldly suggests that for the sake of society, the student should be permanently barred from using magic. His expression. Even so, Frey continues his psychological torment, claiming he is being nice by only targeting the student's legs, framing his brutality as an. As a result, Frey turns his back on the scene, his long hair flowing as he walks away with a calm, detached expression. Meanwhile, Frey summons a glowing orb of energy in his palm, calmly announcing his next move, Magic Missile, as he prepares to finish. As a result, Frey extends his hand, the magical energy pulsating intensely, while David's eye reflects the blinding light of the incoming attack. Even so, Frey unleashes the attack and David screams in agony as the impact hits the scene filled with the raw, violent energy. A student's face, showing a thoughtful and slightly impressed expression as they contemplate the recent events. The students continue their conversation, their expressions serious as they acknowledge the shift in the academy's hierarchy. The academy grounds, showing the imposing architecture as students gather to discuss the recent, shocking victory. Meanwhile, students gossip in the hallways, whispering about Frey's overwhelming victory over David, their faces filled with disbelief and curiosity. A student explains the grim details of David's defeat, noting that he was sent back to his family with severe permanent injuries effectively. As a result, other students discuss the situation, agreeing that David deserved his fate for his past behavior and noting that the academy's. Then, students point and whisper as they spot Frey walking down the hallway, their expressions a mix of fear, awe, and confusion regarding his. Even so, Frey walks confidently through the hallway, surrounded by whispering students, his presence commanding and mysterious as he ignores the gossip. An older student approaches Frey, stopping him to confirm his identity, the tension in the air palpable as the two face each other. Meanwhile, Frey looks at the stranger with a calm, unimpressed expression, asking who he is. The stranger introduces himself as Duman Mylost, a fourth-year trainee. Then, Frey acknowledges Duman's status as an upperclassman, maintaining his cool, composed posture while facing him in the hallway. Even so, Frey's eyes shows a subtle, sharp glint of focus, suggesting he is sizing up the situation. Meanwhile, Duman's eyes narrow slightly, his expression shifting to something more calculated as he continues the conversation. Meanwhile, Duman gestures with his hand, inviting Frey to join an exclusive group known as the Trauman Rings. Then, Duman explains that the Trauman Rings is an elite assembly of trainees representing the academy, shown standing together in the background. Even so, Duman holds up his hand, showing off a glowing ring, emphasizing that membership is exclusive and by invitation only. Even so, Duman proudly displays the ring, asking Frey if he thinks it is cool, clearly trying to impress him with the status. Meanwhile, Duman continues to brag about the ring's quality, mentioning it is made of pure gold by a master craftsman, while Frey looks on. At this point, Duman claims the ring guarantees job security after graduation, while Frey covers his face internally lamenting his lack of a. As a result, Duman prepares to drop a name, trying to build suspense about the leader of the Trauman Rings. Even so, Frey dismisses the offer entirely, causing Duman to react with shock and disbelief at his lack of interest in such a. A new figure steps in, telling Duman to stop, noting that they cannot convince Frey through this approach. At this point, Frey looks up, surprised to hear the name of the leader, Peruan Jun, being mentioned. As a result, Peruan Jun stands tall, greeting them with a polite smile, while Duman bows respectfully in his presence. Meanwhile, Peruan Jun introduces himself as the manager of the Trauman Rings, addressing Frey directly while Duman stands by. Frey stands with his back to the viewer as two men approach him. As a result, Frey stands calmly, facing the two men who are attempting to recruit him. Then, Frey looks down with a subtle, knowing smile, seemingly unimpressed by the men's proposition. Meanwhile, Frey dismisses the men, waving his hand in a gesture of disinterest. As a result, Frey's eyes glow with a faint blue light, hinting at his hidden power or true nature as he continues to. The man who was trying to recruit Frey apologizes, looking flustered and sweating, while Frey remains in the foreground, seemingly unbothered. Even so, Frey walks away, his silhouette framed by a glowing aura, while the man who tried to recruit him watches him go. A dinner table shows various dishes, including fish, steak, and a glass of wine, indicating a formal or celebratory meal. As a result, Frey and a red-haired woman are eating at the table. The red-haired woman continues eating, ignoring Frey's protests. The dark-haired woman rests her chin on her hand, looking thoughtful as she mentions that she could not find any information on battling. The red-haired woman continues to eat, while Frey looks at her, frustrated that she is following him around because he is not teaching her. The red-haired woman looks surprised, asking if Professor Jane also knows about it. As the pressure continues, the dark-haired woman takes a sip of her drink, mentioning that she has heard rumors about it in the... As the pressure continues, the dark-haired woman looks at Frey, asking him to tell her more if he is not bluffing. As a result, Frey takes a sip from a mug, looking calm and collected while the dark-haired woman watches him. The dark-haired woman's eye, showing a look of surprise or realization. Even so, Frey leans in close to the dark-haired woman, his hand on her shoulder, telling her he can teach her more interesting things. Meanwhile, Frey whispers to the dark-haired woman, suggesting they continue their conversation in her room, while she looks flustered. At this point, Frey has his arm around the dark-haired woman who is blushing deeply and questioning why she is reacting this way. As a result, Frey and the dark-haired woman in an intimate moment. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman yells at the others to stop acting so shamefully toward the professor. Meanwhile, Frey stands alone on a bridge at night, looking out over the water under a full moon. As a result, Frey observes the academy, noting the magical barriers protecting it. Then, Frey continues to ponder why information about historical figures like Cassigen, Schweizer, and Iris remains relatively intact after 4,000 years. The red-haired woman approaches Frey on the bridge. At this point, Frey's face, showing a moment of quiet reflection as he contemplates the past and the current state of the world. Then, Frey and the red-haired woman stand on the bridge, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. Even so, Frey breaks the silence, addressing the red-haired woman by name and stating he has a question for her. At this point, Frey dismisses her critique and presses her for information on who the strongest person in the academy is, noting that. As a result, Isabel looks away, blushing, and clearly struggling with her reaction to Frey's directness. Even so, Isabel looks visibly excited, her face flushed as she reacts to Frey's offer. Meanwhile, Isabel explains the hierarchy of strength at the academy, identifying Peruan Jun as the strongest trainee and naming 2 professors before hesitating to. At this point, Isabel reveals that her aunt is the strongest person, leaving Frey surprised by the revelation. As a result, Frey identifies Isabel's aunt as Lady Cirrus Trisnine, the director of Westwood Academy. The dark-haired woman stands nearby, listening to the conversation between Frey and Isabel. Meanwhile, Frey reacts to the mention of a 6-star mage, his expression unreadable as he processes the information. At this point, Frey explains that while mages can theoretically reach 9-star, it has been 3,000 years since anyone achieved that level. As a result, Frey notes that 8-star is considered the practical limit for mages, with very few having attained it throughout history-making. Then, Frey looks away, seemingly lost in thought again after sharing his knowledge. Even so, Frey speculates that the academy's director must be the one responsible for the powerful spell protecting the school. At this point, Frey reflects internally that the spell's complexity is beyond what a 6-star mage should be capable of, hinting at deeper mysteries. As a result, Frey stands on a balcony with 2 other individuals, likely students or associates, as they discuss the Trauman rings. Then, Frey observes the glowing magical dome protecting the academy from the balcony. Even so, Frey calls out to Isabel, who turns to look at him with a curious and slightly flustered expression. Meanwhile, Frey's eyes reveals his intense focus and internal calculation. At this point, Frey speaks with Isabel on the balcony, expressing his concern about involving an innocent child in his dangerous mission. As a result, Frey muses about reaching 7-star magic, causing Isabel to react with shock and disbelief. A woman with dark hair, likely a professor or senior figure, scoffs at Frey's goal of reaching 7-star magic. Even so, Frey calmly states that he intends to reach 7-star by the end of the vacation, leaving the others stunned by his audacity. The dark-haired woman smiles dismissively at Frey, telling him it is good to dream big even if his claims seem like bluffs. At this point, Frey looks at the woman with a stoic expression, his gaze sharp and unreadable. Then, Frey leans in close to the woman, teasing her by suggesting his love is as big as his dreams. At this point, Frey looks on with a weary expression, seemingly tired of the social dynamics and the bickering between the others. The woman agrees with Frey's comment, further irritating Isabel. Meanwhile, Isabel demands to know what the woman meant by her comment, but the woman dismisses it as nothing. A night scene shows the academy buildings illuminated by streetlights against a dark, cloudy sky. Meanwhile, Frey stands alone on the balcony, reflecting on his situation. The moon shines brightly in the night sky, as Frey concludes that his current path is the quickest way to achieve his goals. 2 weeks have passed since the previous incident. At this point, Frey is confronted in a hallway by a group of students. The injured student, David, approaches Frey on crutches, threatening him and claiming he will not lose to someone he considers trash. As the pressure continues, the confrontation takes place in a large, open hall within the academy. Meanwhile, David, still on crutches, continues his verbal assault, threatening to make Frey regret being born. As David attempts to order his lackeys to attack, Frey instantly casts a magic missile spell, knocking David off his feet. As a result, David is sent flying backward, his crutches clattering to the floor as he falls, completely overwhelmed by Frey's sudden magical retaliation. Then, David lies on the ground in pain, groaning, while his companions look on in shock and fear at the display of power. Even so, David is sprawled on the floor, defeated and injured, with his crutches lying nearby. At this point, students whisper among themselves, shocked by the news of David's defeat and the severity of his injuries. As a result, Frey walks away from the scene, looking nonchalant, while others watch him with a mix of fear and confusion. Even so, Frey reflects on his situation, noting that he needs more practical experience to master the use of mana within his current body. A new, larger student approaches Frey, calling him out for his treatment of David. The large student confronts Frey, demanding a conversation. As the pressure continues, the large student, Alex, questions Frey about his magical abilities with a smug, intimidating expression. Then, Frey is surrounded by Alex and his group in a dimly lit, storage-like area, indicating a trap or a confrontation. Even so, Alex introduces himself, clearly expecting Frey to know who he is and to be intimidated by his status. Meanwhile, Alex continues to assert his dominance, claiming to be Frey's upperclassman and demanding respect. At this point, Alex threatens Frey, boasting that he can easily defeat him with minimal effort. As a result, Alex demands to know exactly what Frey did to David, framing it as an offense against his brother. Then, Frey remains unimpressed, questioning whether Alex is actually insulting him or not, given the strange phrasing. Even so, Frey asks if he is being bullied, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the hostile environment. At this point, Frey is visibly irritated by the behavior of the students, labeling them as annoying brats. As a result, Alex questions if Frey thinks he is untouchable now that he has dealt with David. Then, Alex boasts about his past achievements in a magic competition, trying to prove his superiority to Frey. Even so, Alex makes a final, ominous threat, declaring that today will be Frey's funeral. Meanwhile, Frey stands his ground in the storage room, calmly mocking Alex and his group for their pathetic attempt at intimidation. As a result, Alex scoffs at the idea of needing to gang up on someone as weak as Frey. The magic missile strikes with precision, sending the group of bullies flying backward. The remaining students look on in shock, stunned by the sudden turn of events. At this point, Alex and his cronies lie defeated on the floor, groaning in pain. Then, Frey dismisses the entire encounter as a waste of time, openly calling the students kids. Even so, enraged by Frey's insolence, the bullies prepare to retaliate. At this point, another student, the second son of the Pinalark house, joins in the shouting. As a result, Frey, completely unfazed by their posturing, prepares to cast another spell. Then, Frey unleashes another barrage of magic missiles, striking the remaining students with overwhelming force. The remaining bullies, desperate and angry, charge at Frey. Meanwhile, Frey continues to spam magic missile, effortlessly repelling every attack. As a result, Frey finishes the fight, leaving the entire group defeated on the floor. Then, Frey sighs, looking at the defeated students scattered across the floor. Meanwhile, Frey is seen slumped over a desk, surrounded by papers and books. As a result, Frey looks up to see a red-haired girl standing over him. The girl confronts Frey about his recent behavior, noting that he has been causing chaos everywhere he goes with his magic missile. Meanwhile, Frey flails on the desk, complaining about his situation. The girl looks at Frey with a mix of surprise and fascination. The girl asks Frey what he wants, trying to steer the conversation back to business. Even so, Frey lies face down on a desk, looking exhausted and disheveled. At this point, Frey, still lying on the desk, continues his explanation. As a result, Isabel stands in the classroom, looking at Frey with admiration. Even so, Isabel asks Frey what he will teach her next. Meanwhile, Frey's face shows him looking thoughtful and slightly weary. As a result, Frey wonders to himself when he actually started tutoring Isabel. He muses that if he trains her properly, she could become a very powerful mage, perhaps reaching 7 or 8 stars. Meanwhile, Frey addresses Isabel by name, preparing to give her a new lesson. At this point, Frey tells Isabel that he will talk about battling this time. As a result, Isabel reacts with surprise and excitement, stating that she will leave to train during the upcoming vacations. Then, Frey explains that if she accompanies him, she will see real battling with her own eyes, though he warns her it will be. Even so, Frey warns Isabel about the risks, but she interrupts him, declaring with determination that she will accompany him regardless of the danger. At this point, Isabel looks back at Frey with a calm, resolute expression, showing she is serious about her decision. The story shifts to a view of the academy grounds and mountains. Isabel stands in the middle of a town, looking overwhelmed and exhausted under the weight of an enormous, overstuffed backpack. As a result, Frey questions why Isabel is carrying so much gear, pointing out they are not going camping. Then, Isabel, still blushing and looking flustered, changes the subject and asks Frey where they are headed. Meanwhile, Frey announces his destination to Isabel in a public square. A wide shot shows the Hispania Mountains, a towering, jagged range surrounded by swirling clouds. Then, Frey and Isabel huddle together, looking down at a map or document Isabel has retrieved from her bag. The map shows the route, and Frey explains that they can reach Hispaniola using a warp stone, followed by a half-day journey. At this point, Isabel looks determined, stating that she never expected their journey to be easy from the start. As a result, Frey gives a small, knowing smirk, seemingly impressed by her resolve. As the pressure continues, as they walk through the market, Isabel asks Frey about the warp stone. Even so, Frey remarks that such technology did not exist 4,000 years ago. Meanwhile, Frey observes that while magecraft has stagnated, technology has advanced, which explains why the current trainees are so unskilled. As a result, Isabel looks concerned, noting that the convenience of warp stones comes with the drawback of high costs. Then, Isabel explains that the distance between Cow Symphony and Hispaniola makes it quite costly. Even so, Isabel states it will cost roughly 10 gold. Meanwhile, Isabel waits patiently while Frey frantically searches his pockets and bags for money. At this point, Frey holds up a single gold coin, looking devastated. As a result, Frey has a sudden realization, his eyes widening as he remembers that Isabel is also a noble and must have money. Then, Isabel looks at Frey with concern, asking if he is feeling unwell. Even so, Frey suddenly acts overly friendly, dancing around Isabel and asking her how much money she has, much to her confusion and annoyance. Meanwhile, Isabel bluntly tells Frey she has no money on her. At this point, Isabel explains that she believes gratification makes people lazy and that she did not bring travel expenses for her training journey. As a result, Frey loses his temper, pointing at Isabel and demanding she go home to get money. Even so, Isabel yells back, defending her need for her belongings, while Frey finally snaps and tells her to be quiet. Meanwhile, Frey and Isabel continue their journey, with Frey struggling under the weight of Isabel's massive pack. As they navigate the harbor, they are being watched by a suspicious man, hinting at hidden dangers lurking in the area. The ship they are looking at is massive, and they realize it is a primary mode of transport for many. Meanwhile, Frey is stunned to learn that the ship is free for academy trainees, a revelation that could solve their financial woes. As a result, Frey's excitement grows as he imagines the high-quality meals they might receive on the journey. Then, Frey is so delighted by the prospect of free, high-quality food that he expresses his newfound appreciation for the academy. Their hopes are dashed when they are told the ship is already at capacity, forcing them to reconsider their plans. The news gets worse as they learn they will have to wait 4 days for the next ship. As the pressure continues, the realization of the 4-day wait is too much for Frey, who collapses in despair. The two share a look of mutual exhaustion and skepticism regarding their current situation. Even so, Frey tries to find a silver lining, but his frustration returns as he notices something that irritates him. They receive information about another ship that is also free for trainees, offering a potential solution to their travel problem. At this point, Frey accepts the information with a mix of relief and lingering fatigue. The story shifts to a group of pirates, the Blood-Red Raiders, planning their next move. The captain gives the order to move, clearly planning something dangerous and significant. One of the pirates, a man with an eye patch, laughs in anticipation of the upcoming raid. As the pressure continues, the pirate defends his choice as a symbol of his profession, while the captain remains unimpressed by his logic. The pirates continue their discussion, showing their lack of sanity and their commitment to their violent lifestyle. The captain reveals their plan to target a specific ship, choosing a vulnerable location for their ambush. As the pressure continues, the pirates are eager for the loot they expect to gain from the upcoming raid. The captain threatens his subordinate while confirming that their target is a ship full of wealthy students. Then, Frey and Isabel have chosen the Corteso for their journey, unaware of the danger that awaits them. The captain of the Corteso greets his passengers, establishing his authority and the ship's identity. At this point, Frey's keen observation skills lead him to question the unusual emptiness of the ship. The captain reveals the dangerous waters they are about to enter, providing context for the ship's low occupancy. Then, Isabel's fear is met with the captain's reassuring, yet potentially deceptive, confidence. The captain explains the defensive measures in place, highlighting the presence of elite mages. The captain's arrogance regarding their safety sets the stage for a sudden, catastrophic reversal. The captain's dismissive attitude toward the pirates is interrupted by a sudden, violent impact. As the pressure continues, the captain's confidence is shattered as the reality of an attack hits home. The sudden turn of events leaves Isabel visibly shaken, while Frey prepares for the inevitable. As a result, chaos erupts on deck as the crew realizes the pirates have successfully ambushed them. The arrival of the pirate ship signals a dire threat that defies the captain's expectations. As the pressure continues, the captain's disbelief highlights the severity of the situation. Meanwhile, Isabel's realization of the escort ship's fate adds to the mounting tension. At this point, Frey's calm demeanor contrasts sharply with the panic surrounding him. The destruction of the escort ships leaves the Corteso completely vulnerable to the pirates. The sea is in chaos, as a mysterious, overwhelming power tears through the warships, leaving the onlookers stunned. As a result, moments earlier, the captain spotted their target, the Corteso, and prepared for the assault. The realization that the Corteso is heavily guarded sends a wave of panic through the pirate leadership. The captain reveals their trump card, a mysterious, dark mage summoned specifically for this raid. As the pressure continues, the summoned lich, Dullard, manifests his terrifying power, his skeletal form wreathed in dark, necrotic energy. The captain formally introduces the lich, Lord Dullard, a powerful entity contracted for this singular, destructive purpose. As the pressure continues, the sheer, suffocating presence of the lich leaves the pirate crew trembling in fear. The pirate can barely contain his terror as the lich's power intensifies. The reality of the lich's existence is a waking nightmare for the pirates, who are only now grasping the gravity of their contract. As the pressure continues, the captain shuts down any dissent with a violent threat, maintaining his iron grip on the crew. Even so, Dullard begins his incantation, the air around him warping with dark, necrotic energy. The lich's eyes burn with a cold, ancient hunger as he prepares to unleash his power. With a chilling command, the lich calls upon the elements, manifesting a deadly ice-based spell. As a result, giant, crystalline spears of ice materialize, hovering in the air like frozen daggers of death. The unsuspecting fleet sails on, oblivious to the magical bombardment about to rain down upon them. As the pressure continues, the crew of the Corteso is caught off guard as the sky fills with the lich's lethal ice constructs. Meanwhile, panic erupts on the deck as the crew realizes they are under a magical assault. The woman moves to intercept the attack, weaving a defensive spell to shield the ship from the incoming ice. A burst of flame erupts, a desperate attempt to counter the lich's freezing assault. The ice spears strike with devastating force, shattering the ships and turning the sea into a graveyard of ice. As the pressure continues, the force of the impact sends crew members flying, the ship groaning under the weight of the magical assault. At this point, despite her efforts, the woman struggles to hold back the overwhelming power of the lich's magic. The strain of the magical defense is too much, and the woman cries out in pain as her barrier begins to fail. As the pressure continues, the defensive line collapses, and the ice spears rain down, sealing the fate of the escort ships. With the escort ships destroyed, the captain orders his crew to move in and claim their prize. A group of pirates on a ship cheer and shout in excitement, their expressions filled with manic glee as they witness the destruction. A pirate captain in a red coat praises the skeletal mage Dullard for his impressive display of power in destroying the warships with. As a result, Dullard the skeletal mage looks on with glowing red eyes, his expression shifting to one of confusion as he mutters. The pirate captain looks visibly shaken and terrified, sweating profusely as he reacts to the sudden and overwhelming display of magical power. Even so, Dullard stands amidst dark magical energy, his posture rigid as he contemplates the discrepancy in his spellcasting. Meanwhile, Dullard stands on the deck, surrounded by purple magical aura, while the pirate captain watches him nervously from a distance. A view of the sea shows the aftermath of the attack, with one ship still floating despite the destruction surrounding it, raising questions. The pirate captain approaches Dullard cautiously, attempting to remind him of their original plan to take hostages rather than destroy the ship. As the pressure continues, the pirate captain continues his plea, emphasizing the necessity of using the passengers as hostages to achieve their goals. Even so, Dullard looms over the terrified pirate captain, his presence radiating an intimidating and dark magical pressure that causes the captain to. At this point, Dullard explains his reasoning for the attack, stating that he wanted to prevent the targets from escaping or resisting though. The pirate captain looks confused and unsettled by Dullard's cryptic explanation, questioning what he means by his words. Then Dullard reveals that there is something unusual on the ship, while in the background, the crew tries to maintain order among the A hooded figure sits alone on a chest in the middle of the chaotic deck, seemingly unaffected by the panic around them. The hooded figure, whose face is obscured by shadow, showing a faint, mysterious smile. The red-haired woman looks visibly shocked and distressed as she contemplates the total annihilation of the warships. As the pressure continues, the silver-haired man looks out over the sea, his expression thoughtful as he expresses concern about something other than. The silver-haired man notes that one of the 3 ice spears vanished mid-air, suggesting an outside intervention. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman asks the silver-haired man if he was the one who intervened, but he denies it. The silver-haired man reflects on the mana fluctuations he sensed, realizing that he couldn't block the attack and feeling a strange connection to. The silver-haired man recalls a memory of being confined in the abyss, his mind reeling from the presence he sensed, which reminded him. The silver-haired man clenches his fist, realizing that the mana he sensed belongs to an undead, not a demigod. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman asks the silver-haired man who blocked the attack if it wasn't him, and he responds with uncertainty. A massive grappling hook slams into the side of the ship, tearing through the wood with violent force. The students on deck react with sheer terror as the attack begins. Even so, pirates swarm the deck, brandishing swords and shouting. Meanwhile, chaos erupts on the deck as pirates strike down the crew and students. At this point, Frey and the red-haired woman stand together amidst the unfolding carnage. Even so, 2 pirate leaders observe the ship with greedy eyes. The pirate captain stands before the terrified students, counting them like livestock. The pirate captain, flanked by his 2 lieutenants, addresses the students with a mock-friendly tone. A group of pirates confronts a mysterious figure on the deck of a ship at night. As the pressure continues, a burly, bearded man with a mohawk smiles mockingly, revealing that he knows exactly what the ship is. A young man in a white uniform stands his ground against the pirates, indignantly scolding them for their crude behavior and insults. The young mage warns the pirates that they have made a grave mistake, boasting that the ship is filled with talented trainees destined to. As the pressure continues, the young mage shouts with intense conviction, telling the pirates they have chosen the wrong ship to raid. The pirate captain looks visibly shocked and alarmed, shouting for the young mage to wait as he realizes something is wrong. As the pressure continues, the young mage begins casting a spell, his hands glowing with magical energy as the young mage's eyes widen in sudden, intense shock as his spell is interrupted. A dagger flies through the air and strikes the wooden crate right next to the young mage, pinning his clothing and stopping his movement. The Mohawk pirate looms over the young mage, mocking him for his arrogance and declaring that they will not allow. As the pressure continues, the young mage is paralyzed with fear, trembling as the dagger remains embedded in the wood right beside his head. A mysterious hooded figure observes the scene, noting that the dagger was aimed at the neck but tilted slightly, suggesting it was a. The hooded figure stands in the shadows, wondering if the person who blocked the attack aimed at the ship is the one responsible for. As the pressure continues, the hooded figure speaks to the young mage, calmly warning him that he is not an opponent he can face. The hooded figure commands the young mage to stay down and not cause any more trouble. The Mohawk pirate, looking serious, prepares to stop playing around and deal with the situation properly. As the pressure continues, the Mohawk pirate points at another trainee, deciding to use him as a pawn in their scheme. The Mohawk pirate notices the puddle and mocks the trainee for wetting his pants. The hooded figure watches the scene unfold, pleading for the pirates to stop their cruelty. As the pressure continues, the trainee who was previously targeted is now struggling in the dark, turbulent water. Back on the deck, the other trainees are visibly shaken and horrified by the cruelty they have just witnessed. Then 2 trainees, one wielding a bow and the other preparing a magical attack, confront the pirates with righteous fury. As the pressure continues, the 2 trainees launch a combined magical and physical attack toward the pirates. The attack hits, but a mysterious, dark energy manifests on the deck, absorbing or deflecting the magical blast. The trainees are stunned and terrified, their expressions shifting from anger to pure shock as they realize the nature of the entity they. As the pressure continues, the skeletal figure, revealed to be a lich, smiles with a sinister, toothy grin. The lich's glowing red eyes reveals his true, terrifying nature. One of the trainees, clearly recognizing the entity, is paralyzed with fear, unable to comprehend the reality of what is happening. The trainees stare in horror at the lich, who stands amidst the pirates. As the pressure continues, the lich stands in his full, terrifying glory, his presence commanding the entire deck. Then 2 other trainees, a man with long gray hair and a woman with red hair, look on. The gray-haired trainee confronts the pirates, demanding to know if they have made a contract with an undying being, his voice filled with shock. As the pressure continues, the lich's face looms large, his red eyes burning with malice as he warns the mortals that they are. The Mohawk pirate laughs off the warning, stating that they are pirates and only care about money, showing their complete disregard for the danger. The trainees are appalled by the pirates' greed and insanity, realizing that they are dealing with people who, the protagonist, seen from behind, observes the Lich and the pirates on the deck. The Mohawk pirate, looking arrogant and unbothered, commands the hidden individual to come out, clearly unaware of the true power he is dealing with. The Lich, with glowing red eyes, demands that the person who blocked his magic reveal themselves, his voice filled with cold authority. The Lich's red eye flares with intense magical energy as he threatens to kill everyone if the person. The Lich summons a massive swirling vortex of dark energy, filled with sharp crystalline shards, preparing to unleash. The massive magical vortex above the ship intensifies, with the crystalline shards poised to strike. The Mohawk pirate, looking nervous and sweating, tries to reason with the Lich, calling him Lord Dullard, and attempting to stop him from attacking. The Lich reacts with irritation or pain, his red eyes glowing intensely as he lets out a sharp exclamation, possibly interrupted by the Mohawk pirate touches his head, visibly shaken and terrified by the Lich's overwhelming presence, realizing the true danger they are in. A boot stepping onto the wooden deck, signaling the arrival of someone new, or the movement of the protagonist as he steps forward. The protagonist, cloaked and mysterious, stands before the Lich, who is still surrounded by his dark, magical aura. The Lich stares directly at the protagonist, his skull-like face filled with malice, as he asks if he is the one who blocked. As the pressure continues, the protagonist, with a calm and confident expression, confirms that he is indeed the one who interfered with the Lich demands the protagonist reveal his name, while the other characters on the deck watch the confrontation with bated breath. The protagonist reaches up to pull back his hood, preparing to reveal his identity to the Lich and the onlookers. The trainees and the pirate captain look on in shock and disbelief as the protagonist prepares to reveal himself, sensing the significance of the moment. The red-haired trainee, her eyes wide with shock and fear as she watches the protagonist, clearly recognizing him or the gravity of his actions. The gray-haired trainee looks on with a contemplative expression, his mind racing as he tries to process the identity of the mysterious figure. The protagonist, now fully revealed, stands confidently before the Lich and the others, declaring his name to be Peruan Jun. A red-haired female trainee looks at her companion, a silver-haired male with a mix of shock and concern. The red-haired trainee continues to praise Peruan Jun, noting his academic excellence and their ongoing rivalry for the blonde trainee observes the silver-haired male, noting that, while their grades are similar, the male's magical stage is significantly higher. The trainees on the ship look toward Peruan Jun, who stands alone, and express relief, believing they are saved by his presence. The blonde trainee Peruan looks physically strained, noting that it is difficult for him to even stand straight. The silver-haired male observes the Lich, noting it is at least 5-star level, and observes that Peruan has. As a result, Peruan uses his magic to cancel the Lich's attack, with the male observing that surviving. As the pressure continues, the male tells the red-haired trainee to move away because the area is still. As a result, Peruan looks at his hand, noting that while he stopped the attack, his body feels. Then, Peruan stares at the towering, ominous Lich, acknowledging that it is an opponent he cannot face. The Lich addresses Peruan, commenting that his luck is good today to have found such excellent material. At this point, Peruan reacts with shock and fear as the Lich's glowing red eye focuses on him. The captain of the ship appears, and Peruan asks him what his goal is. As the pressure continues, the captain claims they will escort the trainees to their destination, Cow Symphony. As the pressure continues, the captain clarifies that they will provide the escort only after receiving advance payment. The silver-haired male realizes that the pirate's true motivation is simply money. At this point, Peruan breaks his silence, addressing the pirate captain and the looming Lich. As a result, Peruan makes a desperate, selfless offer demanding that the pirates keep him as the soul. Then Peruan attempts to bribe the pirates, claiming the June House will pay double their expected profit if. The pirate captain scoffs at Peruan's offer, pointing out that they have the powerful Lich, Lord Dullard, on their side. At this point, Peruan admits his own lack of strength against the Lich but prepares to reveal a surge of intense, crackling blue magical energy erupts from Peruan, signaling the activation of a powerful, hidden ability. Then, Peruan stands shrouded in a menacing blue aura, his face obscured by shadow save for a single glowing eye. The silver-haired observer continues to watch, clearly impressed by Peruan's spirit and potential, noting that he is starting. As the pressure continues, the Lich, Dullard, rejects Peruan's defiance, his massive, shadowy maw opening to deliver a chilling refusal. Even so, Dullard unleashes a wave of dark, necrotic energy, declaring that Peruan's mana is delicious and that, meanwhile, Peruan reacts with sudden, intense alarm as the Lich's dark magic surges toward him, catching him off guard. At this point, dark, shadowy tendrils lash out from the Lich's magic, ensnaring Peruan and pinning him in. As a result, Dullard looms over the scene, his glowing red eyes fixed on Peruan as he vows. Then, Peruan is completely bound by the dark, suffocating tendrils, his struggle futile as the Lich claims him as his own. The pirate captain, seeing the negotiations have failed and Peruan is incapacitated, gleefully orders his crew to seize all the trainees. The trainees panic as the pirates swarm them, one trainee crying out in terror and begging for help as he is cornered. As a result, pirates aggressively restrain the trainees, using force to subdue them, while others look on, helpless and terrified. The pirates continue their assault, terrorizing the trainees. A pirate with an eye patch laughs maniacally, clearly enjoying the chaos and the successful capture of the trainees. The one-eyed pirate scans the deck, his gaze landing on something that catches his interest, his expression shifting to one of predatory curiosity. As the pressure continues, the red-haired girl looks up, startled and frightened as the pirate approaches her with. The pirate tries to coax the red-haired girl to follow him, feigning kindness while the silver-haired man watches. The silver-haired man, still standing with the girl, calmly asks the pirate to move slightly to the side. The silver-haired man gestures for the pirate to move to the left, his demeanor remaining cool and authoritative despite the pirate's presence. The silver-haired man then gestures for the pirate to move to the right, continuing to treat the dangerous situation with casual indifference. At this point, Frey looks at the pirate with a deadpan, unimpressed expression, questioning if the pirate is addressing him. The one-eyed pirate glares at Frey, insulting him by calling him a piece of unburnt firewood, while confirming he is indeed talking to him. Then, Frey stands with the red-haired girl behind him, looking annoyed as he tells the pirate to watch his attitude. The pirate laughs mockingly, calling Frey a frilly rascal and questioning if he is asking for a beating. The pirate cracks his knuckles, dismissively telling Frey that he cannot do what he wants and demands that Frey come over to him. At this point, Frey stands his ground, refusing to move and challenging the pirate's authority to order him around. The other captured trainees watch the confrontation in terror, whispering to each other to not fan the flames of the pirate's anger. A trainee shouts at Frey, asking if he has gone blind from his recent popularity and begging him to stay quiet. The pirate's expression darkens with intense, murderous rage as he glares at Frey. The pirate steps forward, his heavy boot slamming onto the wooden deck with force. As the pressure continues, the pirate lunges toward Frey with his scimitar raised, taunting him about who dies. As the pressure continues, the pirate swings his blade down toward Frey, who remains calm and composed. Then, Frey effortlessly counters the pirate, delivering a powerful, swift strike that sends the pirate flying backward. Even so, Frey uses a burst of magical energy to blast the pirate away, leaving the red-haired girl safe behind him. The pirate is sent tumbling through the air, crashing into the deck as a result of Frey's sudden, overwhelming power. At this point, Frey looks down at the defeated pirate with a cold, knowing gaze confirming that the silence of the night is shattered as something strikes the water beside the ship. As a result, Frey's presence on the ship surprises his former academy peer, who still views him as a failure. Then, Frey remains composed, standing amidst the confusion on the deck. Meanwhile, Frey's combat prowess is far beyond what anyone expected, as he effortlessly neutralizes a threat. The realization of Frey's true power begins to sink in for those watching. Then, Frey's physical contact catches the student completely off guard. Even so, Frey takes command of the situation, guiding the student through the impending conflict. The student is left reeling from Frey's direct and assertive behavior. As a result, Frey advances toward the enemy, exuding an aura of calm confidence. The enemy is thrown into disarray by the sudden turn of events. As the pressure continues, the antagonist dismisses his comrade's failure with crude insults. The antagonist is stunned by Frey's sudden, overwhelming presence. As the pressure continues, the Lich observes the battle, impressed by Frey's speed. The antagonist is overwhelmed by the force of Frey's strike. Meanwhile, Frey punishes the antagonist for his refusal to negotiate. At this point, Frey reveals his ruthless side, contrasting himself with someone more merciful. The remaining antagonists are terrified as they witness their vice-captain's defeat. Then, Frey dehumanizes his enemies, signaling his intent to finish them off. Meanwhile, Frey's eyes reflect the immense power he is about to unleash. At this point, Frey slams the antagonist's head into the deck with immense force, creating a shockwave. Then, Frey stands ready to finish the battle, his power fully unleashed. Even so, Frey unleashes a massive, concentrated blast of blue mana, overwhelming the pirates on the deck. At this point, close-up shots of the pirates' faces reveal their expressions of shock and terror as they realize their attacks are ineffective. As a result, Frey stands at the center of a swirling vortex of blue mana, effortlessly repelling the pirates who tried to surround him. A pirate watches in disbelief, his face contorted in fear as he witnesses Frey's display of power. Meanwhile, Frey delivers a swift, powerful kick to one of the pirates, sending him reeling. At this point, Frey continues to manipulate the mana around him, creating a localized whirlwind that traps and incapacitates the remaining pirates. As a result, two pirates observe the carnage from a distance, one of them clutching his injured arm. A pirate captain holds a woman hostage, using her as a shield while he desperately tries to figure out who Frey is. Meanwhile, Frey lunges forward with incredible speed, closing the distance between him and the pirate captain who is holding the hostage. At this point, Frey lands on the deck with a heavy thud, his presence commanding the space. Then, Frey's eyes reveals his cold, calculating demeanor. Even so, Frey executes a powerful aerial strike, knocking the pirate captain away from the hostage. At this point, Frey continues his assault, using his physical agility and magical enhancements to strike down the remaining pirates with precise, devastating kicks. The surviving pirates are in disarray, turning on each other in their confusion and fear. Then, Frey begins to gather a massive orb of energy above his head, his expression cold and detached. The pirates are stunned by Frey's actions, unable to process the sheer scale of the magic he is channeling. Meanwhile, Frey channels his mana, his hands glowing with intense light. A massive beam of pure magical energy erupts from Frey's position, obliterating everything in its path. The aftermath of the blast leaves the deck in ruins, with debris scattered everywhere. Meanwhile, Frey stands amidst the destruction, his posture relaxed yet vigilant. At this point, Frey's expression is unreadable as he surveys the scene. As a result, Frey turns his attention to the remaining pirates, his gaze cold and intimidating. The pirate captain, still holding the hostage, threatens to kill her if Frey moves. Even so, Frey maintains a calm, focused expression as he stares down the remaining pirate captain. Meanwhile, Frey speaks with a calm, mocking tone, questioning the pirate captain's empty threat. The pirate captain's eyes widen in shock and terror as he realizes his leverage is failing. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman, held hostage by the pirate, suddenly channels a powerful surge of magical energy. The woman's eye reveals it glowing with intense blue magical energy. As the pressure continues, the pirate captain's face is illuminated by the intense blue light of the woman's magic. The woman unleashes a powerful lightning strike, engulfing the pirate captain in a massive discharge of electrical energy. The pirate captain appears in the throes of the electrical attack, his eyes rolling back and foam appearing at his mouth as the pressure continues, the woman stands over the fallen pirate captain, who lies defeated on the deck. The remaining pirates watch in absolute horror and disbelief as their captain is effortlessly defeated by the woman they thought was a helpless hostage. A young man, previously bound and held captive, watches the scene with a look of stunned realization. As the pressure continues, a dark skeletal figure looms in the background surrounded by a purple aura while a bearded man looks on. The red-haired woman stands calmly, her expression composed and slightly smug, having successfully neutralized the threat. As a result, Frey and the woman stand facing each other on the deck. The woman smiles confidently at Frey, asking for his opinion on her combat performance. Even so, Frey looks at the woman with a knowing, slightly amused expression. A large bearded man with a mohawk stands on the deck, mocking Frey for his disguise as a trainee, noting that his combat. The bearded man laughs, acknowledging that Frey successfully tricked him, though he remains in control of the situation. The bearded man's expression shifts to a sinister, predatory grin, signaling his intent to negotiate. As the pressure continues, the bearded man proposes a deal to Frey, standing amidst the chaos of the ship deck where trainees lie defeated. The bearded man acknowledges Frey's strength, but points out the impracticality of Frey trying to save all the captured trainees by himself. As a result, Frey remains stoic and unimpressed, demanding the man get to the point. The bearded man reveals his proposal. He is willing to release half of the captives. As the pressure continues, the bearded man offers to let Frey choose half of the trainees to save, framing it as a mutually. Meanwhile, Frey listens, his expression unreadable as he processes the cruel offer. A captured trainee cries out for their mother, highlighting the desperation of the situation. The bearded man continues to manipulate the situation, claiming that Frey can save face while they both profit. As the pressure continues, the bearded man smiles broadly, emphasizing the win-win nature of his proposal. Meanwhile, Frey calls the man out for his moral depravity, noting the irony of calling it a win-win when his crew has already. The bearded man shrugs, indifferent to the loss of his men, and reiterates that Frey can choose who to save. As the pressure continues, the bearded man insists that Frey can personally decide which half of the trainees to keep. Even so, another trainee lunges toward Frey, pleading for their life. A trainee grabs Frey, begging him to select them to be saved. As the pressure continues, the trainee continues to plead, offering anything Frey asks for if he will just spare them. Then, another trainee joins in, desperate to be included in the selection. The trainees begin bidding against each other, offering higher amounts of gold to Frey to secure their safety. Meanwhile, Frey looks visibly stressed and overwhelmed by the sudden auction taking place around him. At this point, Frey turns to Isabel, questioning how they should handle the situation, noting they lack even basic travel funds. The trainees continue to outbid each other, while Isabel looks on in shock and anger at the absurdity of the situation. As the pressure continues, the trainees are in a state of absolute panic, shouting over one another to prove their worth to Frey. At this point, Frey, accompanied by Isabel and another companion, looks visibly annoyed by the trainee's incessant pleading. As a result, Isabel looks at Frey, who stands with his back to the camera, clearly exhausted by the trainee's behavior. Even so, Isabel confronts the trainees, scolding them for their greed and lack of character. Meanwhile, Isabel continues her lecture, disgusted by the trainee's selfishness. At this point, Frey steps in to deliver a stern lesson, pointing his finger as he defines the true role of a mage. As a result, Frey continues his lecture, emphasizing that a mage must always prioritize the lives of others over their own, regardless of. Then, Isabel, clearly flustered and perhaps confused by Frey's sudden shift in demeanor, snaps at him. The story shifts to a dark, ominous figure shrouded in purple energy, standing on the deck alongside a bearded man. As the pressure continues, the bearded man looks on with a serious, focused expression, his eyes fixed on the mysterious figure beside him. The mysterious figure, radiating dark energy, stands silently as the bearded man observes him. As the pressure continues, the bearded man, identified as Dullard, thinks to himself about the silent, undead figure. The undead figure speaks, dismissing the bearded man's doubts with arrogance. Even so, Dullard is shocked, realizing the undead figure has read his mind. At this point, Isabel observes Frey, noting the unique and powerful glow of his mana. As a result, Frey looks concerned, his face showing a bead of sweat as he assesses the situation. The undead figure, now fully revealed as a skeletal entity with glowing red eyes, stands amidst a swirling vortex of dark energy. Even so, Dullard, looking up at the towering undead figure, expresses his blind trust in him. Meanwhile, Isabel and Frey stand together, watching the dark energy gather. The undead figure stares directly at Frey, his red eyes burning with malice. As a result, Frey remains unimpressed, sighing as he brushes his shoulder. The undead figure unleashes a powerful spell, manifesting as a series of sharp, purple, crystalline projectiles. Even so, Isabel watches in shock as the spell is cast, recognizing the danger of the magic being used against them. The undead figure commands his attack to strike, his voice filled with murderous intent as he shouts for his opponent to die. At this point, Frey stands calmly as the massive, sharp projectiles close in on him, his expression unbothered by the incoming assault. The projectiles strike, but Frey remains standing, his aura shielding him from the impact as the energy dissipates around him. As the pressure continues, the purple magical tendrils lash out, striking the deck and surrounding the characters. Even so, Isabel watches the scene with wide, terrified eyes. Meanwhile, Frey dodges and maneuvers across the deck, his expression focused. At this point, Frey pauses for a brief moment, his face showing a rare look of concern. The undead figure floats in the center of the magical energy. Even so, Frey continues to scramble across the wooden deck, trying to evade the purple energy tendrils that are actively hunting him. Meanwhile, skeletal, dark hands erupt from the ground, reaching upward with malicious intent. A tight close-up on Frey's eyes, showing his intense concentration and the reflection of the chaotic battle. Then, multiple skeletal hands rise from the deck, surrounding Frey and closing in on his position. Meanwhile, Isabel's face is filled with pure panic as she watches the scene, her voice trembling as she tries to call out to Frey. The magical energy converges violently on the deck, creating a massive explosion of dark power as Isabel screams Frey's name. A violent burst of dark, shadowy energy erupts on the deck of a ship, causing significant destruction too. A red-haired woman stands her ground, conjuring a protective barrier to shield herself and a man in a. The dark energy continues to lash out, forcing the man in the white suit to recoil in pain. A cloud of dust and debris obscures the scene with a voice calling out for Frey, indicating concern. The dust clears to reveal a gaping hole in the ship's deck, with the sea visible below. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman stands on the damaged deck looking toward a man tied up. Then, Frey, bound by dark ropes, grimaces in frustration and pain, clearly struggling against his restraints. A skeletal, robotic-looking entity with glowing red eyes reacts with surprise, its jaw agape. The skeletal entity is encased in a circular barrier of dark energy with the bladed projectiles embedded. Meanwhile, Frey stands, looking shocked and disoriented as dark energy swirls around him. As the pressure continues, the skeletal entity unleashes a powerful blast of energy, shouting as it attacks. The skeletal entity is confused, wondering why its attack targeted it instead of the intended target. The skeletal entity stands on the deck, while a mysterious, silver-haired figure stands calmly in the background. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman and Frey look on in shock, their expressions filled with disbelief. The skeletal entity asks if Frey is all right, while the silver-haired figure stands nearby. As the pressure continues, the skeletal entity reacts with shock, its eyes widening as it realizes what happened. The silver-haired figure mocks the skeletal entity, having effortlessly dodged its attacks and moved behind it. As the pressure continues, the skeletal entity is sent flying through the air, clearly overwhelmed by the silver-haired. The skeletal entity is stunned by the silver-haired figure's ability to perform such complex calculations and movements on. The silver-haired figure stands calmly, looking down at the red-haired woman, asking if she is all right. The red-haired woman stares ahead with wide, shocked eyes, her expression frozen in disbelief as she processes the. Then Frey stands calmly on the deck, his posture relaxed, while a large spectral armored figure looms behind. Meanwhile, Frey looks up toward the sky, his expression one of realization as he observes a swirling dark. A skeletal dark armored entity floats within the center of the magical vortex, surrounded by massive glowing blue ice. The skeletal entity hovering in the air expresses a sinister intuition, deciding that destroying the ship is the massive ice spears begin to descend rapidly toward the ship, creating a violent impact as they strike. A massive, shimmering blue barrier suddenly manifests over the ship, successfully intercepting and shattering the incoming ice spears. Then Frey stands on the deck with his arm raised, his expression calm and focused as he single-handedly. The skeletal entity stares down in absolute disbelief, its jaw hanging open as it struggles to comprehend how. The skeletal entity, now enraged, summons an even larger, more menacing ice crystal, its magical aura intensifying as. The skeletal entity crouches in the air, its body crackling with dark energy as it prepares to launch. As a result, Frey leaps toward the massive ice spear, his fist glowing with concentrated energy as the skeletal entity watches in horror as its massive ice spear is shattered into fragments by Frey's direct. Meanwhile, Frey and the red-haired woman stand on the deck, both raising their hands to channel energy into. The skeletal entity hovering in the distance expresses its frustration and disbelief, questioning how a mere 5-star mage. Then Frey looks toward the entity, his expression serious as he calmly explains that his power comes from. The skeletal entity is stunned, floating in the air as it asks Frey if he truly possesses the. As a result, Frey stands confidently in the air, his hands on his hips as he taunts the skeletal entity to fight harder. The skeletal entity, clearly rattled by Frey's display of power, demands to know his true identity. Even so, Frey addresses the entity's confusion, mockingly repeating the reputation he holds at Westwood Academy as an eternal loser. Then Frey reveals his true identity as Lucas Trauman, the legendary mage who has returned after 4. From the deck of the ship, the red-haired woman and her companion watch the distant confrontation. The red-haired woman looks on with a worried and intense expression, her hand clutched to her chest as she observes the magical fallout. The skeletal entity reacts with disbelief and rage, dismissing Frey's claim as nonsense. The skeletal entity shouts that Lucas Trauman is dead, launching a desperate, aggressive, magical attack toward Frey. Meanwhile, Frey effortlessly maneuvers behind the skeletal entity, taunting it by remarking that it looks better from behind. A powerful burst of magical energy erupts as Frey strikes the skeletal entity, causing a blinding flash of light that signals the turning. The skeletal entity groans in pain as Frey stands directly behind it, having successfully reached into its chest. At this point, Frey holds the glowing blue life vessel in his hand, calmly questioning the entity about. As a result, Frey explains that he took the time to locate the vessel's position as it varies. Even so, Frey crushes the life vessel, and the skeletal entity's body begins to disintegrate and shatter into. At this point, Frey floats calmly in the sky, his hand still extended after the destruction of the entity. As a result, Frey's face shows a cold, determined expression, highlighting his absolute dominance and lack of mercy for his enemies. The red-haired woman and her companion watch in disbelief, stunned by how easily Frey managed to defeat such a formidable opponent. Even so, 2 men on the deck look on in shock and fear, their expressions conveying the gravity of the situation as they. A burly man with a mohawk stares in horror, questioning why the entity died despite being an undying being. At this point, Frey descends from the sky, looming over the burly man with an intimidating presence. At this point, Frey coldly informs the man that negotiations have broken down, signaling that he is no. As a result, Frey delivers a final chilling ultimatum to the group, declaring that everyone present. The aftermath of a violent skirmish on a ship deck is revealed. A heavily wounded man with a mohawk and a red coat sits slumped against a structure on the deck, his chest bearing a. As a result, Frey stands on the deck, his back to the viewer, facing the wounded man. Then, Frey appears in profile, his face partially obscured by shadow as he maintains a calm and composed demeanor while holding a thin dark. A group of people, including a woman with red hair and a man in a captain's hat, stand together on the deck looking. The red-haired woman's face shows her wide-eyed, stunned expression as she processes the events that just transpired. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman stands behind Frey, who is walking away. Then, Frey and the red-haired woman stop as a blonde man approaches them on the dock, initiating a conversation. Meanwhile, Frey continues walking past the blonde man without acknowledging him, leaving the red-haired woman surprised by his dismissive behavior. At this point, Frey glances back with a stoic expression, his demeanor remaining detached. The blonde man bows deeply to Frey, thanking him for saving his life and promising to never forget the favor. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman, flustered, asks the blonde man to stand up, clearly embarrassed by his display of gratitude. Even so, Frey looks on with a neutral expression, seemingly unaffected by the emotional display. At this point, Frey turns his attention to the blonde man, asking about his physical condition after blocking the lich's magic. The blonde man replies that he feels refreshed after purging the dirty blood from his system. Then, Frey tells the blonde man to stop bluffing, while the red-haired woman chides him for being rude to the June house. The blonde man addresses Frey directly, asking what exactly happened to him to cause such a change. As the pressure continues, the blonde man notes that Frey defeated a lich that even court magicians would struggle against. The blonde man recalls Frey's reputation as the most untalented trainee in Westwood history. As the pressure continues, the blonde man questions if Frey had been hiding his true skills all along. Then, Frey responds vaguely, suggesting that life is full of unexpected changes. The blonde man shrugs, accepting Frey's vague answer. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman listens intently as the blonde man continues to speak. The blonde man invites Frey to visit his house, expressing a desire to show his gratitude properly. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman is shocked by the invitation, realizing the significance of an invitation from the prominent June house. Even so, Frey looks at the red-haired woman who is wearing a large backpack and has a comical, star-eyed expression of excitement her. Meanwhile, Frey, looking slightly annoyed or dismissive, remarks that he will visit the June house only if he has time. The red-haired woman scolds Frey for his arrogance, emphasizing the immense status of the June house and how many nobles would kill for. As a result, Frey has a sudden realization, his eyes widening as he remembers something important. Then, Frey turns to Peruan and shamelessly asks to borrow 20 gold coins, leaving Peruan visibly stunned by the request. The red-haired woman is furious, grabbing Frey by his collar and demanding to know what he is doing now, clearly embarrassed by his behavior. The red-haired woman continues to berate Frey for using a favor as an excuse to ask for money while Peruan watches the scene. As a result, Frey explains that he needs the money for the expensive warp stone in Cow Symphony, while the red-haired woman continues to. Then, Peruan understands why Frey was heading to the capital and begins to reach into his bag to provide the funds. Even so, Peruan hands the money to Frey, telling him he does not need to pay it back as it is a gesture. Meanwhile, Frey is stunned to see that Peruan has given him 300 gold coins instead of the 20 he requested, the coins glowing brightly. At this point, Frey tries to return the excess money, stating that 20 gold is enough, but Peruan insists he keep it all. Then, Peruan explains that he would love to invite Frey immediately, but he is currently caught up in marriage talks with his fiancée. Even so, Peruan mentions that returning home will involve many preparations, and the red-haired woman tells him to stop bragging. At this point, Frey's face, his expression unreadable as he listens to Peruan. As a result, Frey, with a mischievous look, asks Peruan if his fiancée has an older sister, causing Peruan to sweat nervously. Even so, Peruan explains that she is the daughter of the Aquareed house, a household known for its skilled knights, but he is. Meanwhile, Peruan expresses his concern that the family will be disappointed to learn that their future son-in-law is a weak magician. As a result, Frey calls out to Peruan, getting his attention. Then, Frey places a hand on Peruan's shoulder, telling him not to lose confidence and that his handsome face will help him. The red-haired woman is visibly annoyed with Frey's behavior, asking if his mind is only filled with obscene thoughts. At this point, Frey's face as he smiles, looking amused by the situation. Then, Peruan laughs along with them, seemingly relieved by the light-hearted moment. Even so, Frey and the red-haired woman continue their conversation with the woman, remarking on how long it has been since she laughed. Meanwhile, Peruan stands on the bridge, preparing to depart. At this point, Peruan insists that Frey must visit the June house, expressing his desire not to live his life as someone who. Then, Frey's face, showing a calm and thoughtful expression as he considers the invitation. Even so, Peruan's face, looking serious and sincere as he waits for Frey's response. The red-haired woman watches Peruan with a soft, blushing expression, remarking that it is a good sight to see. As a result, Peruan walks away, waving goodbye to Frey and the woman. Even so, Frey teases the woman about her wealth or status, noting her deep pockets, which causes her to react with visible agitation. Meanwhile, Frey looks confused by the woman's intense reaction, while she continues to shake with frustration or embarrassment. The woman shouts in frustration, apologizing for being penniless, as they stand on the bridge under the moonlight. A young woman with red hair strikes a dramatic, heroic pose while wearing ornate, polished silver armor. A man's face shows him with a deadpan, unimpressed expression. The man, now revealed to have long gray hair, scolds the woman for her choice of clothing. As the pressure continues, the woman snaps back at the man, shouting that she was simply excited about the high-quality clothes she was. An older man observes the argument between the two companions. The man and the woman walk together through the town. As the pressure continues, the man holds up a leather bag, admiring its quality and utility. As the pressure continues, the man asks the woman if she is in a bad mood. The man's face as he sighs, showing his weariness with the current situation. As the pressure continues, the man and the woman stand together in the town. A dark, ominous vision of a hooded figure surrounded by red eyes, holding a globe. The man contemplates whether the demigod fears human growth, but dismisses the idea, reasoning that such beings view humans as insignificant insects. As the pressure continues, the woman interrupts the man's deep thoughts, informing him that they have arrived at the warp stone. The man scratches his cheek, looking slightly embarrassed or dismissive, and decides he will just find the answers himself. As the pressure continues, the man thinks to himself that he will simply force the answers out of them. An official at the Warpstone facility announces that the warp is about to begin and instructs passengers to stay within the magic circle. The man expresses admiration for the facility's design, noting the different sections. The Warpstone begins to glow intensely, and a large magic circle appears in the sky above the facility, signaling the start of. As the pressure continues, the man warns the woman that those unaccustomed to warping might feel nauseous. As the pressure continues, the woman's eye, showing the intense light of the warp reflecting within it. A blinding flash of light engulfs the scene as the warp process fully activates. The warp energy forms a tunnel of light, pulling the facility and its passengers into the magical vortex. The Warpstone platform sits empty and silent after the departure, the energy dissipating. The warp concludes with a flash of energy. Even so, Frey looks around with a calm, observant expression, noting the surroundings. They have reached Hispania. The pressure changes immediately. As a result, Frey notes the lack of change over 4 millennia. Then, Frey prompts Isabel to move on. Even so, Isabel suffers from the side effects of the warp. Meanwhile, Isabel makes an excuse for her sickness. At this point, "I'll be fine if I eat a lit." The tavern is bustling. The pressure changes immediately. As the pressure continues, the sound of a creaking door. Meanwhile, Frey orders beer, shocking Isabel. The pressure changes immediately. At this point, Frey, "What are you doing?" Then, "Why don't they sell any beer at the academy? Back in my days, everyone above 13 drank regardless of the law." As the pressure continues, the food is served. As a result, seeing how you're planning to enter the Hispania Mountains, you must be newcomers. Even so, Frey enjoys his drink. The pressure changes immediately. Meanwhile, having ambitions is a privilege for the young. As a result, I've heard that it's a paradise for monsters. The tavern keeper looks at them with a stern, intense expression, telling them they know nothing about the true nature of the mountains. Meanwhile, are those brats trying to go to the Hispania Mountains? At this point, Frey appears in a comical, chibi-style depiction, happily stuffing his face with sausages. The tavern keeper continues to wipe down a bottle, his expression turning somber as he apologizes to the group. As the pressure continues, the tavern keeper recounts his son's past, describing him as a noisy boy who dreamed of becoming a mercenary. Even so, Isabel listens intently, her expression serious as she asks the tavern keeper about the fate of his son. The tavern keeper delivers the grim news that his son died after entering the Hispania Mountains. As the pressure continues, the tavern keeper explains the circumstances of his son's death. The tavern keeper reiterates his warning, emphasizing that even experienced mercenaries do not return from the Hispania Mountains unscathed. Even so, Frey suddenly breaks the tension by loudly declaring that the food was delicious, seemingly unfazed by the heavy conversation. Meanwhile, Frey maintains a calm and composed expression as he asks the tavern keeper for information about the monsters that inhabit the mountain range. The tavern keeper looks on with a weary, knowing expression, clearly concerned about the duo's determination to enter the mountains despite his warnings. As the pressure continues, the tavern keeper stares directly at them, questioning their resolve to continue even if it means certain death. The tavern keeper holds up a map of the mountain range, pointing to a specific area as he likely gives them final advice. As a result, Isabel appears in a close-up, deep in thought. Then, Isabel asks the tavern keeper how much they owe for the meal, showing her polite and responsible nature. The tavern keeper refuses payment, telling them to put it on their tab and return alive to pay him back. Meanwhile, Frey jokingly questions the tavern keeper's business model, asking if his establishment even works properly. At this point, Frey and Isabel stand outside the tavern under the moonlight. Then, Frey appears in a close-up, his expression determined as he says he cannot wait for their next encounter, implying he intends to survive. The tavern keeper watches them go, a small, knowing smile on his face as he reflects on their departure. Meanwhile, Frey and Isabel stand before the imposing, moonlit Hispania Mountains, ready to begin their dangerous journey. A monstrous, tree-like creature with glowing green eyes emerges from the shadows, its jagged form looming over the protagonists in the Hispania Mountains. At this point, Frey swiftly engages the tree monster, his blade glowing with magical energy as he slashes through the creature's wooden hide. As a result, Frey channels a concentrated sphere of bright, crackling blue mana in his palm, preparing a powerful magical strike. Then, Frey unleashes the electrical discharge at the tree monster, causing it to convulse as the energy surges through its body. Meanwhile, Frey stands calm and composed, his expression stoic as he surveys the dangerous environment of the mountains. At this point, Frey and the red-haired woman stand amidst the dark, twisted forest of the Hispania Mountains. Then, Frey turns his back to her, correcting her assumption with a mysterious tone, leaving her confused. Even so, Frey continues walking through the woods, prompting the woman to ask for his true motive for their journey. Meanwhile, Frey reveals their destination is the legendary dungeon of Schweizer, shocking the woman. The woman questions if he truly means the dungeon created by the great sage Schweizer. As the pressure continues, the woman describes the rumors surrounding the dungeon, which is said to grant world-ruling power, while questioning its very existence. Even so, Frey recalls a memory of Schweizer, describing a mountain that pierces the clouds, featuring a lake with a small island at. The woman looks at Frey, waiting for further explanation as they continue their trek. As a result, Frey expresses that it is a place Schweizer would have loved, and they simply need to locate the island within it. Then, Frey warns the woman that the place is not just a legend, but an extremely dangerous location. Even so, Frey states that one must be at least a 6-star mage to challenge the dungeon, leaving the woman stunned. Meanwhile, Frey holds up a single finger, signaling his intent. At this point, Frey declares he will reach the 6-star stage within 1 month, shocking the woman further. As the pressure continues, the woman insists that reaching 6-star takes decades of training, urging him to find a proper place to train instead. Even so, Frey tells her to stay alert and find a safe place where they can concentrate mana, growing impatient with her questioning. As the sun sets, a blue, spectral monster appears, crackling with magical energy. The woman dodges an attack from the monster, moving quickly through the forest. As the pressure continues, the woman, panting and exhausted, channels her own magical energy, preparing to counterattack. Even so, Frey stands silently, watching the woman fight, his expression unreadable as he observes her progress. Meanwhile, Frey's face appears in close-up, his expression calm and focused as he confirms he has successfully located the ideal spot for their training. At this point, Isabel looks up in awe, her eyes wide with shock and wonder as she takes in the sight of the location is revealed to be a hidden, secluded waterfall tucked away against a rock face, providing a perfect, isolated environment for their training. Then, Frey and Isabel stand before the waterfall, with Frey appearing confident and ready to begin, while Isabel follows him into the hidden area. Even so, Frey holds his hand out, manifesting a brilliant, crackling sphere of golden lightning energy, demonstrating his power to Isabel. Meanwhile, Frey stands within the cavernous space behind the waterfall, declaring that this is the exact location where they will spend the next. At this point, Frey addresses Isabel directly, calling her by name, as he prepares to reveal the secret training method she has been. As a result, Frey tells Isabel that he is finally going to teach her the legendary battling training method of Kasajin, which she. Even so, Frey maintains a serious, cautionary tone, warning Isabel that the technique is extremely dangerous and could even be fatal if performed incorrectly. Meanwhile, Frey's hands appears glowing with a soft, ethereal light as he begins to channel his mana, preparing to demonstrate the technique. At this point, Frey sits in a meditative lotus position, his body beginning to glow as he starts to draw in massive amounts. As a result, Isabel watches with wide-eyed intensity, her expression shifting from excitement to pure shock as she realizes the scale of what. As the pressure continues, the energy around the waterfall intensifies, creating a visible vortex of power as Frey continues his deep meditation. Meanwhile, Frey remains perfectly still, surrounded by a swirling aura of blue magical energy that seems to be pulling everything toward him. As a result, Frey sits in the center of the swirling vortex, with Isabel watching from a distance, clearly overwhelmed by the display. Then, Isabel observes in awe, noting that Frey is drawing mana from the entire Hispania mountain range, a feat that seems impossible to her. Even so, Isabel questions if Frey is pushing his own internal mana capacity to its absolute limit, showing her deep concern and amazement. The mana vortex reaches a critical point, glowing with blinding intensity as Frey continues to compress the energy. As the pressure continues, the mana vortex continues to swirl, now glowing with a vibrant purple hue as Frey nears the completion of. As a result, Frey's eyes, which are now glowing with a sharp, focused purple light, signaling his heightened state of concentration. Then, Frey exhales, his expression calm as he announces that the initial preparations for the training are finally complete. Even so, Frey looks toward Isabel, his eyes still glowing as he prepares to begin the actual training process now that the mana. Meanwhile, Isabel stands in the center of a powerful mana vortex, her arms outstretched as she channels energy. Then, Frey and Isabel stand facing each other within the lingering magical aura. Meanwhile, Frey breaks his serious demeanor, flashing a wide, bright, and somewhat mischievous grin at Isabel. At this point, Isabel looks flustered and confused, clutching her chest as she asks Frey what he is doing. Even so, Isabel looks at Frey with a soft, slightly blushing expression clearly affected by his praise, and the sudden shift to a glowing, intricate magic circle appears in the air, manifesting as a portal or storage interface. A close-up shows Lucas's hand reaching into the magical rift to retrieve dried rations. Then, Lucas offers food to his companion, who is sitting on the ground. Even so, Lucas explains to his companion that her brain is misinterpreting the sensation of mana repletion as physical satiety. Meanwhile, Lucas firmly tells his companion to force herself to eat. The two sit on mats inside the cave, facing each other. Then, Lucas also eats, his expression calm and composed. The companion remarks that she never imagined she would be spending time like this with Lucas, reflecting on their changing dynamic. Meanwhile, Lucas reflects on his observations of her, noting her unordinary willpower and spirit, even when she was being bullied as a student. The companion listens intently, her expression soft and contemplative as she processes Lucas's words. As a result, Lucas continues, noting that she feels like a different person lately, and he is puzzled by the change in her demeanor. The companion observes that Lucas seems to know exactly where he is going and acts without hesitation, which surprises her. Even so, Lucas looks directly at her and asks a probing question about which version of him she considers the real one. The companion stares back, her eyes wide and thoughtful, clearly affected by his question. She smiles slightly and dismisses the question, suggesting that both versions are simply the real him. As a result, Lucas responds with a philosophical observation, stating that humans do not change, but rather they grow. Then, Lucas closes his eyes, looking peaceful and content with his own statement. Even so, Lucas thanks her for the change she has undergone, acknowledging her growth. The companion notes that previously, Lucas would never have brought her along to train alone like this. She looks at him, her expression shifting as she realizes the implications of their current situation. As the pressure continues, she suddenly blushes, realizing they will be spending an entire month alone together in the cave. Then, Lucas dismisses her concern, telling her not to worry about useless things and reiterating that he is not interested in kids. The companion looks annoyed and flustered, wondering why she feels so displeased by his comment. Meanwhile, Lucas turns away and begins casting a barrier spell on the cave wall to secure their resting place. At this point, Lucas explains he is setting up a barrier to prevent monsters from entering while they sleep. As a result, Lucas lies down on his mat, telling her he is off to sleep and advising her to get plenty of. The companion stares at him, thinking that while she is relieved he is safe, she really wants to punch him. The companion's face as she begins to stir from her sleep. As the pressure continues, the companion wakes up, rubbing her eyes and looking around the dim cave. The companion, still groggy, asks how long she has been asleep. Meanwhile, Lucas tells the companion that her break is over and that they are starting the real training today. At this point, Lucas explains that they will be using Kasajin's training method, which he calls battling. He remains seated in his meditative. As a result, Lucas gives a stern warning, emphasizing that this specific training method is extremely dangerous. Then, Lucas instructs the companion to sit and watch him, rather than trying to imitate him immediately. Even so, Lucas begins to channel his mana, creating a swirling, vibrant aura around his body. A glowing orb of energy forms in front of Lucas, swirling with distinct fire and water attributes. The orb of mana continues to spin, with the fire and water elements clearly separating and then merging in a chaotic dance. The companion watches in awe and confusion, wondering if Lucas is truly separating his internal mana into fire and water attributes. As the pressure continues, the companion's eye, reflecting the intense energy, a metaphorical visualization of the mana battle, a fiery demon representing fire mana, and a graceful ethereal figure representing water mana are locked. The ethereal water figure strikes at the fiery demon, showing the active conflict between the two elemental forces. As a result, Lucas's face, showing his intense concentration as he maintains the balance. As the pressure continues, the fiery demon retaliates, lashing out with flames. Meanwhile, another close-up of Lucas, sweat beading on his forehead as he struggles to keep the two forces from overwhelming him. The fiery demon looms large, representing the overwhelming nature of the fire mana. A scale appears, with the water figure on one side and the fire demon on the other. The companion looks on with wide eyes, completely stunned by the complexity and danger of what Lucas is demonstrating. The companion watches from the side as Lucas continues his demonstration. As the pressure continues, the companion's face, showing her intense focus and determination. As the pressure continues, the companion begins to channel her own mana, mirroring Lucas's posture. A swirling orb of mana begins to form, showing the initial stage of the elemental fusion technique. As the pressure continues, the fusion reaches a critical point where the fire and water elements clash violently. The companion suffers a physical reaction to the unstable mana, coughing up blood as the strain of the technique overwhelms her body. As the pressure continues, the companion collapses to the ground, gasping for air and clutching her chest. A pool of blood on the ground serves as a grim reminder of the companion's failure. The companion looks up from the floor, watching Lucas in the background. He appears completely detached from the chaos around him, his expression serene. A woman with long red hair is seen from behind, standing in the water and drying her hair with a white cloth. The woman, Isabel, looks off to the side with a pensive, slightly sad expression, holding a white cloth to her chest. As a result, Isabel kneels on the rocky ground near the waterfall, organizing items from a bag. Then, Isabel sits on the ground, carefully placing small, smooth stones in a specific pattern on a larger flat rock. There is one large stone and several smaller ones placed in a deliberate formation. Meanwhile, Isabel's hand reaches out to place another stone onto the rock, adding to the existing formation. At this point, Isabel holds a stone in her hand, looking at it with a serious expression. As a result, 2 stones placed side by side on the rock. Then, Isabel looks over her shoulder, her expression one of concern or observation. Even so, Isabel questions how much longer Frey intends to continue his intense and dangerous training method. Meanwhile, Isabel walks through a cave entrance, carrying her bag. At this point, Isabel crouches down, placing a white cloth into her bag. As a result, Isabel's eye, which is wide and filled with shock or realization. A surge of intense blue magical energy erupts, filling the frame. Even so, Frey sits in a meditative pose, surrounded by a massive, swirling aura of blue mana. Meanwhile, Isabel stares in disbelief at the display of power. At this point, Isabel stands back, her expression one of pure shock. As a result, Frey remains in his meditative state, the blue mana aura intensifying around him. He is sweating and appears to be pushing himself, thinking that his current progress is still too slow. Even so, Isabel watches Frey from a distance as he continues his intense meditation. Meanwhile, Isabel, kneeling, begins to feel the pressure of the mana. At this point, Isabel tries to channel her own energy, attempting to stabilize herself against the overwhelming mana pressure radiating from Frey. A dark, stormy sky filled with rain. The rain falls heavily over the waterfall area, creating a gloomy and wet environment. Even so, raindrops hit the ground near the stones Isabel had arranged. The water pools around them, emphasizing the relentless nature of the storm. As a result, inside the cave, the blue mana aura continues to flare around Frey, while Isabel struggles to maintain her position nearby. Then, Isabel's eyes widen in pain as the mana pressure becomes too much for her to handle. Even so, Isabel collapses to the ground, coughing and gasping for air, unable to withstand the intensity of Frey's mana output. Meanwhile, Isabel is in deep concentration, her face flushed and sweating as she struggles to maintain her mana control. At this point, Isabel observes the blue mana swirling around her hand, marveling at her own rapid growth. As a result, Isabel continues her intense training, kneeling on the ground while surrounded by a blue mana aura. Then, Isabel pauses, feeling self-conscious and wondering if she smells bad due to the intense physical exertion of her training. A sudden, loud impact echoes through the cave, causing Isabel to jump in surprise and look toward the source of the noise. The magical barrier protecting the cave begins to shatter under immense pressure. A massive, fiery entity manifests in the cave, overwhelming the space with heat and light. As a result, Isabel's eye, wide with terror and awe as she stares at the creature that has appeared before her. The creature is revealed to be a magnificent, flaming phoenix. Even so, Frey looks on with a calm, focused expression, his eyes fixed on the phoenix as he assesses the situation. Meanwhile, Frey identifies the creature as a phoenix, his tone steady despite the gravity of the encounter. At this point, Isabel is in disbelief, stammering as she questions if it is truly a legendary divine beast, noting their mythical status. As a result, Frey stands calmly in the presence of the phoenix, his demeanor suggesting he is not intimidated by the creature's power. Then, Frey's face, showing a subtle, knowing smile as he observes the phoenix. Even so, Isabel looks back and forth between the phoenix and Frey, her expression a mix of confusion and anxiety. Meanwhile, Frey reflects on the Hispania Mountains, acknowledging that while they are known to house many monsters, the presence of a divine beast is. At this point, Frey explains that the phoenix was drawn to the area by the fire attribute mana generated during his battling training method. The phoenix commands Frey to come to it, while Isabel warns that the situation is dangerous. Then, Isabel shouts in alarm, insisting that divine beasts cannot be tamed by humans, clearly worried about Frey's safety. The phoenix's eye, which appears sharp and intelligent, staring directly at the humans. Meanwhile, Frey turns his attention to Isabel, questioning why she is just staring and reminding her that she came to him for help. At this point, Isabel is startled by Frey's direct question, her eyes wide as she processes his words. As a result, Isabel's eyes, reflecting the intense golden light of the phoenix as she watches the scene unfold. Then, Frey reaches out and touches the phoenix, his hand resting against its flaming feathers with surprising ease. Even so, close-up shots show Frey's hand making contact with the phoenix's fiery plumage. Meanwhile, Isabel watches in complete disbelief, unable to fathom how Frey could touch the phoenix's flame feathers with his bare hands. At this point, Frey explains that the phoenix is not attacking because it shows no hostility toward him. As a result, Frey points out a deep, claw-inflicted wound on the phoenix's body, urging Isabel to look closely. Then, Frey notes that the wound is so severe it nearly reached the phoenix's heart, remarking that it is a miracle the creature is. Even so, Isabel is stunned, her worldview shaken by the sight of the phoenix. At this point, Frey corrects Isabel's misconception, explaining that phoenixes are not truly immortal, as he stands in close proximity to the wounded creature. The focus shifts to the looming threat in the mountains, raising the stakes as the characters realize something powerful enough to harm a hand gently resting on the fiery, glowing plumage of a phoenix. At this point, Lucas stands beside the massive, radiant phoenix, which is surrounded by a swirling aura of golden flames. As a result, Lucas's face, showing a calm, knowing, and slightly amused expression. Then, Lucas stands by the phoenix as a powerful, dark purple energy emanates from him, enveloping the area. A red-haired woman watches the interaction between Lucas and the phoenix, noting internally that the legendary creature is acting like a small, dependent chick. Meanwhile, Lucas, surrounded by the purple energy, comments with a smirk that the phoenix is taking away the benefits of his training. As a result, Lucas tells the phoenix he is only joking and instructs it to remain still, as the process is nearly complete. A profile shot of Lucas, his expression serene and thoughtful as he gazes into the distance. The red-haired woman continues her observation, noting that not only has his expression changed but his manner of speaking is also vastly different. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman's eyes, which are wide and reflective. Then, Lucas continues to speak to the phoenix, teasing it about whether it is avoiding the rain. Even so, Lucas, dressed in dark armor, looks at the phoenix with a confident, challenging smirk. The phoenix flaps its wings, squawking in response to Lucas's taunts. At this point, Lucas challenges the phoenix to a race to a nearby mountain peak, proposing that the loser must go without lunch. As a result, Lucas tells the phoenix to flap its wings at full power if it wants to eat. The red-haired woman watches, wondering if a phoenix regains its healing powers by recovering its energy. The phoenix takes flight, its massive wings creating a brilliant explosion of light and energy that pushes back the rain. As the pressure continues, the fiery, glowing feathers of the phoenix as it soars through the air. As a result, Lucas reaches out to touch the phoenix's head, thanking it for helping him remember old memories and advising it to. The phoenix's eye, which looks intelligent and focused. Even so, Lucas's face, his expression calm and reflective as he looks on. The phoenix launches itself into the air, its powerful wings causing a massive splash of water from the ground below. As the pressure continues, the phoenix soars high into the stormy sky, its golden form glowing brightly against the dark, rainy backdrop. As a result, Lucas and the red-haired woman stand in a cave before a waterfall. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman observes Lucas as he looks at the feather. The red-haired woman notes that the phoenix seems to be a creature that repays its debts. At this point, Lucas makes a sarcastic remark about the red-haired woman, implying she has been a burden while he sheltered her for. The red-haired woman, clearly offended by Lucas's comment, asks if he is talking about her. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman confronts Lucas, asking him why he cannot speak more kindly to humans while Lucas remains seated. The red-haired woman sighs, looking away from Lucas, clearly frustrated by his attitude. A view of the waterfall outside the cave during a rainstorm, establishing the passage of time and the setting. The waterfall scene shifts to a clearer, brighter day, indicating that time has passed. As a result, close-up of green leaves with water droplets against a bright sky, emphasizing the peaceful, natural environment. A flat stone sits on the ground, suggesting a place where someone has been sitting or meditating for a long time. Then, Lucas sits in a meditative pose inside the cave, while the red-haired woman sits nearby, drinking from a water skin. The red-haired woman notes that 4 weeks have passed since they arrived at the cave. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman observes Lucas, noting that he has not eaten and has been meditating for a week, fearing. The red-haired woman looks at Lucas with a mix of concern and awe, reflecting on his mysterious nature. As a result, Lucas appears in a powerful, glowing meditative state, appearing almost divine to the observer. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman thinks about how Lucas is an outstanding person despite his often disrespectful behavior. A flashback or mental of Lucas displaying a sharp, cold demeanor during a combat move. The red-haired woman reflects on Lucas's vast knowledge and mature speech, comparing him to an elderly sage. Then, Lucas is surrounded by a golden, radiant aura, appearing as a powerful, enlightened figure. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman continues to watch Lucas, feeling a deep connection to the memory of the great mage Lucas Trauman. The red-haired woman sits in the cave, hand over her heart, clarifying that her feelings for Lucas are of admiration and respect, not love. The red-haired woman's eye, glowing with a faint magical light, suggesting she is observing Lucas's power. Even so, Lucas appears in a state of deep, intense meditation, his eyes closed as a powerful, swirling blue aura of magical energy. At this point, Lucas stands with his back to the viewer, his muscular form radiating a potent blue magical aura. The red-haired woman's face, capturing her genuine shock and admiration as she witnesses the magnitude of Lucas's achievement. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman smiles warmly, her eyes closed in a moment of sincere respect. Even so, Lucas stands fully upright, his eyes now glowing with a steady, powerful light. Frey stands in a meditative state, his body surrounded by a faint, glowing blue aura of mana. A woman's eye, wide with shock and awe. As a result, Isabel looks at Frey with concern, noting that the youngest person to reach 6-star was 35 years old. Then, Frey rests against a rocky wall, his eyes closed as he continues his meditative breathing. Even so, Frey reflects on his progress, noting that he can now gather mana simply by breathing. Meanwhile, Frey's eyes snap open, his pupils dilating as he senses something. At this point, Isabel rushes toward Frey, calling out his name in alarm. As a result, Frey clutches his chest, his expression pained as he feels the physical toll of his intense training. Then, Frey laughs off his physical weakness, admitting his body is a mess from starving for a week. Even so, Frey declines the jerky, deciding they should go hunt instead. Meanwhile, Isabel asks if Frey will be alright, to which he responds with a sharp dismissive retort questioning who she thinks she is. At this point, Frey and Isabel are startled by a sudden discovery. As a result, Frey and Isabel look down at a group of defeated, unconscious monsters lying on the ground. One of the defeated monsters, showing it is unconscious and incapacitated. Even so, Frey realizes that the Phoenix must have been the one to defeat the monsters, explaining why he didn't sense any threats. Meanwhile, Isabel smiles, concluding that the Phoenix was likely trying to protect them. At this point, Frey addresses the Phoenix, noting that it is taking away the fruits of his training. As a result, Frey tells the Phoenix that if destiny allows, they will meet again. A sudden pained cry echoes through the area, startling Frey and Isabel. Even so, Frey and Isabel exchange a look of concern and alertness, reacting to the unexpected human voice they just heard. Meanwhile, Frey notes that the human voice didn't come from far away, signaling a new potential encounter. At this point, Frey moves quickly, his expression shifting as he prepares for action. As a result, Frey lunges forward with incredible speed, his body surrounded by a powerful gust of wind as he initiates a combat maneuver. Then, Frey strikes with a swift, precise movement, his attack creating a shockwave that surprises Isabel. Even so, Isabel shouts Frey's name in alarm, witnessing his sudden and aggressive intervention. Meanwhile, Frey stands alone in the clearing, having dealt with the threat. A man is pinned against a tree by a knife, crying out in pain and begging for his life. The man continues to beg for his life, tears streaming down his face as he is held captive. A group of bandits hold several captives tied to trees. Even so, 2 captives are tied back to back against a tree, their bodies riddled with throwing knives. Meanwhile, 3 bandits stand together, mocking their leader's poor aim. At this point, Juan mocks Victor for his poor performance. As a result, Victor pushes Juan aside, insisting it is his turn to throw a knife. The bandit leader, Lawrence, shouts at his subordinates to stop messing around. Even so, Lawrence complains about the lack of progress, noting that it has been over a month since they have seen the woman. A bandit sits by a campfire, expressing his frustration about being stuck in the mountains. At this point, Victor prepares to throw his knife, taunting the others and declaring his intention to hit the captive in the forehead. A captive tied to a tree looks on in terror, gasping as he realizes he is about to be targeted. Then, Victor throws the knife with a boastful shout, aiming for the captive. The captive's face as he reacts to the incoming projectile, his eyes wide with fear. A magical barrier suddenly appears, deflecting the knife away from the captive. The knife spins through the air after being deflected, landing harmlessly in the dirt. As a result, Juan and Victor look on in confusion, wondering what just happened to their projectile. Then Juan laughs at Victor, mocking him for failing to hit the target, even suggesting the wind is against him. Even so, Victor is annoyed by the failure and the mockery, deciding it is time to pack up and leave. Meanwhile, Juan's expression shifts to one of shock as he notices someone standing behind them. At this point, Frey stands calmly behind the bandits, having just arrived. As a result, Juan draws his weapon, ready to attack the intruder, calling him a bastard. Then, Victor also prepares to attack, brandishing his knife with a hostile expression. Even so, Frey looks at the captives, his expression cold and detached as he assesses their condition. Meanwhile, Frey's eyes, showing his intense focus and calm demeanor. At this point, Frey reflects on the cruelty of the bandits, disgusted by their actions. As a result, Frey addresses the bandits, his tone dripping with contempt. The bandits are taken aback by Frey's presence and his bold statement, questioning if the captive is actually speaking. Even so, Frey prepares to strike, his eyes glowing with magical energy as he initiates a powerful attack. Meanwhile, Frey unleashes a swift, lethal strike, decapitating Juan in a single motion. At this point, Victor watches in horror as his companion is killed, realizing the danger they are in. As a result, Victor's terrified face, his eyes wide as he realizes he is next. The bandits stare in absolute shock and terror, their eyes wide and sweat beading on their faces as they witness the sudden lethal. A bandit leader, his face contorted in a mix of disbelief and fear. Meanwhile, Frey executes a precise, high-level magical strike. The magical impact creates a violent, swirling vortex of energy, obliterating the immediate area and overwhelming the bandits with raw, concentrated power. As the pressure continues, the bandit leader stares in horror, recognizing the caliber of the magic used against them. Then, Frey's face, showing a calm, cold, and slightly mocking smile. Even so, Frey stands confidently, surrounded by a faint, shimmering magical aura. A woman with red hair stands in a forest, looking visibly distressed and sweating. A wide shot reveals a clearing littered with the bodies of several fallen warriors. The silver-haired man, who maintains a stoic and detached expression. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman confronts the silver-haired man, asking if he killed everyone. The silver-haired man and the red-haired woman look toward the ground, observing the aftermath of the battle. A fallen, defeated man on the ground. As the pressure continues, the silver-haired man stands with his back to the viewer, stating that he cannot ignore the fact that these... A flashback or mental shows a dark, hooded figure with a glowing eye watching two people fighting, implying the silver-haired man's disdain for. The silver-haired man's face, his eyes cold and filled with resolve as he expresses his disgust for the enemy's happiness. As the pressure continues, the silver-haired man and the red-haired woman stand near a wounded survivor who is coughing and struggling to speak. The wounded survivor, battered and bleeding, pleads for his life. The silver-haired man coldly informs the survivor that he has lost too much blood and that they have no obligation to help him. As the pressure continues, the survivor's face as he begs desperately for mercy, the survivor continues to plead, stating he cannot die like this, while the silver-haired man and the red-haired woman listen. The silver-haired man's profile, his expression unreadable as he contemplates the survivor's words, a rocky landscape under a clear sky, emphasizing the isolation of the scene. As the pressure continues, a group of mercenaries gathers in a forest clearing, listening to a report from a survivor. Meanwhile, Captain Karlst, a man with teal hair and a scarred face, sits on a log and questions the survivor about his claims. The survivor, looking terrified, insists that he is telling the truth to Captain Karlst. The survivor describes the silver-haired man's appearance, noting his white hair and the smell of rot, which suggests a supernatural or undead quality. As the pressure continues, the survivor explains that the silver-haired man is no ordinary fighter and that they were completely overwhelmed in the mountains. The survivor recounts how the silver-haired man decapitated their members instantly, leaving him as the sole survivor. At this point, Captain Karlst confirms that the attacker is a magician, and his subordinate agrees. The subordinate analyzes the situation, concluding that the attacker is capable of double casting. Then, Captain Karlst narrows his eyes, identifying the attacker as a battle mage. Even so, Captain Karlst's eye as he confirms the assessment. Meanwhile, Captain Karlst, seen from behind, commands his mercenaries to increase the number of lookouts and to report immediately if they spot the ghost. At this point, Captain Karlst gives a cold, decisive order to his men to kill the target once they have him in position. A mercenary with a monocle asks Karlst if the Aqua Reed house hired the mage. The subordinate explains that the victim was just a random mercenary who had been escorting a mother and child who were picking herbs. Meanwhile, Karlst reflects on the information, noting that the mercenary seemed incapable of hiring a battle mage, deepening the mystery of the mage's identity. A tight close-up of Karlst's eye shows his intense curiosity and suspicion as he wonders who the mysterious mage really is. As the pressure continues, a wide atmospheric shot of a desolate, dusty landscape shows the aftermath of a struggle with debris scattered across. The scene reveals a broken wooden cart and scattered supplies, emphasizing the violence that occurred in the area. A lone survivor, wearing a white hood, struggles to catch his breath while surrounded by the fallen bodies of his comrades. The silver-haired mage with a scarred chest and a sinister grin taunts the survivor, asking if he knows how long he has been. As a result, Sonia Aquareed, the eldest daughter of the prominent Aquareed Night House, stands her ground, sword drawn, as she faces the threat. Then, Sonia is suddenly surrounded by multiple attackers wielding axes, forcing her into a desperate defensive position. Even so, Sonia expertly parries a heavy axe strike from one of her attackers, her expression focused and determined. Meanwhile, Sonia executes a swift, sweeping counterattack, striking multiple enemies at once with her blade. An enemy's face shows his shock as Sonia's blade closes in on him. As a result, Sonia delivers a precise, lethal strike, decapitating one of her attackers in a blur of motion. Even so, Sonia's sword clashes against another weapon, sparks flying as she continues to fight off her assailants. Meanwhile, Sonia, breathing heavily, shouts a defiant command to die as she prepares for another strike against the silver-haired mage. At this point, Sonia lunges forward, her sword clashing against the weapon of a blonde-haired attacker who looks startled. A close-up shows the blonde attacker's wide-eyed shock as he struggles to hold his ground against Sonia's blade. Then, Sonia unleashes a powerful strike, creating a shockwave that forces her opponents back. Meanwhile, Sonia, exhausted and panting, grips her sword tightly, refusing to give up despite the overwhelming odds. The silver-haired mage watches with amusement, impressed that Sonia is still holding onto her sword despite her exhaustion. As the pressure continues, the silver-haired mage acknowledges the rumors about the Luanable Kingdom's flame sword, confirming that they were not exaggerated. Then, two women in religious attire watch the scene, weeping as they call out to Miss Sonia, clearly distressed by her situation. The knight's desperate cry underscores the gravity of Sonia's situation as she continues to struggle against her opponents. Meanwhile, Sonia regains her composure, her steady gaze signaling that she is far from defeated despite the overwhelming odds. The mysterious man watches the conflict unfold with a chilling smirk, clearly relishing the chaos and the challenge Sonia faces. Two terrified maids in purple habits huddle together, weeping and calling out for Miss Sonia. As the pressure continues, a man with teal hair and a jagged scar across his face leers with a sinister expression, licking his lips. Then, Sonia, a blue-haired swordswoman, stands her ground with a sword in hand, breathing heavily. Meanwhile, Sonia, visibly exhausted and sweating, reflects on the grim reality that their escorting knights have been completely wiped out. The scene shows the remaining survivors, two terrified maids, and the retired knight Luther, who is kneeling on the ground, clutching his sword. Then, Sonia surveys the battlefield, realizing she is outnumbered by more than 20 skilled enemies. The antagonist questions Sonia about the whereabouts of her escort magician, showing a calculated interest in her party's composition. At this point, Sonia retorts that a noble house would never rely on a lowly magician, dismissing them as weaklings. The antagonist observes Sonia, confirming his suspicion that the person who previously interfered with his underlings was not part of her group. The antagonist cruelly reassures Sonia that they do not intend to kill her immediately, leaving her confused and alarmed. As the pressure continues, the antagonist's mouth as he licks his lips, emphasizing his depraved intentions. As a result, Sonia looks on with a mix of shock and dawning horror as she begins to understand the antagonist's true intentions. One of the antagonist's thugs leers at the prospect of having a noblewoman as a plaything, highlighting the group's malicious nature. Even so, Sonia's eyes widen with intense rage and disgust as she realizes the depravity of her captors. Meanwhile, Sonia declares that she would rather die than become a plaything for the thugs, showing her fierce resolve. The antagonist remains unfazed, his eyes cold and calculating as he listens to Sonia's defiance. As the pressure continues, the antagonist callously dismisses her threat, stating that if she dies, they will simply take the maids instead. The antagonist explains that they have been living like beggars for a month, just to capture her and his men are hungry for. As the pressure continues, the antagonist muses that they won't be able to kill their captives nicely, confirming the grim fate awaiting them. Meanwhile, Sonia realizes with horror that the only reason the maids were kept alive was to serve as leverage or secondary targets. The two maids huddle together, trembling in fear, their vulnerability starkly contrasted against the brutal situation. As a result, Sonia stands firm, declaring that she will not allow her companions to be dragged down by her situation. Even so, Luther, still kneeling, expresses his unwavering loyalty, stating it would be an honor to die for Lady Sonia while Sonia looks. The antagonist's face, showing a cold, calculating expression. As a result, Sonia closes her eyes, her face showing a mix of sorrow and resolve. Then, Sonia's eye, reflecting her internal turmoil and the gravity of the situation. Even so, Sonia stands with her back to the viewer, holding her sword. The two maids, dressed in purple habits, look up at Sonia with tearful eyes. At this point, Sonia appears in profile again, her expression softening as she listens to the maids. Then, Sonia stands before the kneeling maids, who are begging her to end their lives. The maids continue to plead, explaining that it would be dishonorable to become the bandits' playthings, and that they would rather die. Meanwhile, Sonia grips her sword tightly, her knuckles white. The bandits are shocked and confused, unable to understand what the women are planning. As a result, Sonia stands tall, declaring her intent to protect the honor of the maids and the Aquaride house. Then, Sonia swings her sword in a swift, decisive motion, aiming to end the maid's suffering before the bandits can intervene. The antagonist realizes what is happening and shouts for his men to stop her, his face twisted in panic. Meanwhile, Sonia appears mid-swing, her expression intense as she carries out her grim duty. The antagonist and his men look on in horror, their eyes wide as they witness the unexpected turn of events. As a result, Sonia appears crying, her face contorted with pain and grief as she realizes the weight of her actions. Even so, another close-up of Sonia's eye, showing the intensity of her emotions. The two maids appears on the ground, their expressions peaceful in death. At this point, Sonia looks down at her hands, her expression one of shock and disbelief. As a result, Sonia looks at her empty hands, her voice filled with confusion and anger as she realizes her sword was stolen. Then, Sonia's face appears in close-up, her teeth gritted in frustration and rage. Meanwhile, Sonia clenches her fist, her expression one of deep humiliation and regret. At this point, Sonia looks at the maids, her expression filled with sorrow as she apologizes for not being able to give them. As a result, Sonia stands with her back to the viewer, asserting her authority as the eldest daughter of the Aquareed house. Then, Sonia commands the maids to bite their tongues, her eyes filled with desperation and resolve. The mysterious antagonist finally acknowledges the presence of his hidden opponent, his smirk betraying a sense of calculated anticipation. As the pressure continues, the legendary ghost makes his appearance, instantly changing the dynamic of the battlefield and leaving the others stunned by. A group of adventurers stands in a rocky, desolate area. A red-haired woman supports an injured man, holding him up as they stand together. As the pressure continues, a scarred, dark-haired man with teal highlights stares intensely. The silver-haired man stands calmly, holding a sword, and asks the scarred man if he is the leader of the group. As the pressure continues, the blue-haired woman looks nervous, gripping the hilt of her sword tightly as the confrontation escalates. The scarred man's eyes shows his cold, calculating gaze as he watches the silver-haired man. The scarred man points toward a distant forested area, asking if the silver-haired man came, afterward noting that his base camp is located. As the pressure continues, the scarred man looks visibly angry, demanding to know what the silver-haired man did to his men. The silver-haired man replies calmly, telling the scarred man that he knows what happened and that he took good care of them. As the pressure continues, the scarred man's face contorts in rage, his teeth gritted as he reacts to the silver-haired man's dismissive response. The scarred man orders his subordinates to kill the silver-haired man immediately, fearing he will cast magic if given the chance. The silver-haired man stands surrounded by a blue magical aura, preparing to defend himself against the charging enemies. As the pressure continues, the silver-haired man's face shows his calm, focused expression as he prepares to unleash his power. The silver-haired man unleashes a powerful magical attack, creating a swirling vortex of energy that knocks back his attackers. As the pressure continues, the scarred man is sent flying backward by the force of the magical blast, crying out in pain. The scarred man looks shocked and overwhelmed, questioning the immense firepower of the silver-haired man. The silver-haired man continues his assault, moving with incredible speed and precision, leaving his enemies unable to react. As the pressure continues, the silver-haired man lands a devastating blow, creating a massive crater in the ground and sending debris flying. As the pressure continues, the blue-haired woman shouts at the silver-haired man, demanding to know who they are and what their purpose is. The red-haired woman smiles gently, her eyes closed as she seems to be relieved or perhaps hiding something. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman reassures the others, telling them they can rest easy because they are not their enemies. The scarred man's feet appears as he struggles to regain his footing, clearly shaken by the battle. As the pressure continues, the scarred man prepares to counterattack, claiming he knows a bit about battle mages and that he can handle. The scarred man lunges forward, determined to strike, believing that the silver-haired man's magic has a cycle he can exploit. As the pressure continues, the silver-haired man remains calm, his eyes glowing with magical energy as he prepares to face the scarred man's. The silver-haired mage stands amidst a swirling vortex of magical energy. As the pressure continues, the scarred man, wielding a large sword, watches the magical onslaught with a sinister grin. The scarred man continues to taunt the mage, his expression twisted in a cruel, confident smile. As the pressure continues, the battle intensifies as the scarred man swings his blade, but the mage's defensive magic proves overwhelming. Meanwhile, two more subordinates are caught in the magical blast, their faces contorted in terror as they are thrown backward by the sheer force. The scarred man's eyes widen in disbelief, his pupils trembling. A wide shot shows the mage floating above the battlefield, surrounded by a ring of glowing magical orbs. The scarred man is panting heavily, his face drenched in sweat. As the pressure continues, the mage appears in a silhouette of pure power, his eyes glowing with intense blue light. The scarred man is knocked off balance, his feet sliding across the ground as he tries to maintain his stance against the relentless. As the pressure continues, the scarred man is gasping for air, his mouth wide open in a desperate, ragged breath. The scarred man collapses to his knees, his sword planted in the ground for support. As the pressure continues, the battlefield is left in ruins, with the scarred man's subordinates scattered and defeated across the cracked, dusty ground. Meanwhile, two of the scarred man's subordinates appears in a state of exhaustion, coughing and struggling to breathe as they recover from the. As the pressure continues, the scarred man notices the mage has stopped attacking. The scarred man points a finger upward, his face lighting up with a sudden, desperate realization. As the pressure continues, the remaining subordinates scramble to their feet, encouraged by the scarred man's words. The blue-haired woman approaches the mage, her expression one of concern and urgency. As the pressure continues, the mage holds up his hand, his fingers positioned in a specific gesture. The mage warns the woman to get back, his tone firm and serious. As the pressure continues, the scarred man and his men look around in confusion and fear as the ground shakes beneath their feet. As the pressure continues, the scarred man shouts in disbelief, asking what is happening as the ground continues to shake violently. The entire area is engulfed in a massive tremor, with the ground collapsing inward. As the pressure continues, the ground continues to fracture and crumble, the landscape itself being reshaped by the mage's overwhelming power. The earth itself turns against the attackers, swallowing them whole as the ground gives way. Even so, panic spreads among the men as they realize their footing is gone and they are being buried alive. The leader watches in disbelief as his entire squad is wiped out in an instant. As the pressure continues, the bystanders are left trembling, realizing the sheer lethality of the mage they were observing. The sheer scale of the destruction leaves the witnesses completely speechless. As the pressure continues, the battle ends as quickly as it began, leaving nothing behind but a scarred earth and a stunned group. A young woman with short blue hair stares at the cracked, devastated earth, stunned by the sheer power of the magic used. The blue-haired woman reflects on the impossibility of the feat, noting she has never seen or heard of such advanced double-casting skills. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman smiles, confirming that she, too, has never encountered such a display of magical prowess before. Meanwhile, Frey stands alone, his long silver hair flowing as he looks off into the distance. The blue-haired woman looks at Frey with a mix of awe and confusion, clearly trying to reconcile his appearance with the immense power. A broken, overturned wooden cart lies in the dust, a symbol of the recent conflict. The group stands together in the desert. He pauses, trying to recall where he has heard the name Aquareed before, while Sonia looks offended by his lack of formal courtesy. At this point, Frey retorts that Sonia is not being courteous either, leaving her speechless. Then Sonia looks at Frey frustrated, and asks why he cannot be as kind and gentle as he was when he interacted with. Even so, Isabel looks at him, wondering if he is a barbarian hermit rather than a beggar, while a knight in the background. At this point, Luther explains that the Blake House is a highly noble lineage that helps maintain the Cast Cow Empire. As a result, Isabel continues to question how the head of such a prestigious house, Isaka Blake, could appear so haggard while Frey. Even so, Luther explains that they are heading to a city called Hispaniola nearby. Meanwhile, Frey agrees to guide them, as he is also heading in that direction. As a result, Sonia explains that they must first gather the bodies of their fallen escort knights before they can leave. Then, Frey asks if they intend to bury the knights there, and Sonia confirms they have no choice as they cannot transport them all. Even so, Frey offers to take the bodies to the city for them, leaving Sonia and the others surprised by his sudden helpfulness. Meanwhile, Frey uses his magic to levitate the bodies of the fallen knights into the air, demonstrating his power once again. At this point, Frey gestures with his hands, maintaining control over the levitating bodies. The wooden cart is lifted into the air by Frey's magic, ready to be transported along with the bodies. Even so, Isabel looks shocked and exclaims in surprise, her eyes wide and mouth agape, as she reacts to something Frey has said. Meanwhile, Frey stands by the wooden cart, which is now levitating in the air along with the bodies of the fallen knights. At this point, Luther and the two nuns look on in stunned silence, clearly overwhelmed by Frey's display of magical power As a result, Isabel is visibly agitated and incredulous, shouting at Frey after learning he is only 20 years old as she had. Then, Isabel stares at Frey with a skeptical expression, muttering to herself that no matter how she looks at him, he doesn't seem like. Meanwhile, Frey walks alongside the group, commenting that it is nice to be young, while Isabel remains baffled by his nonchalant attitude. At this point, Frey shifts the conversation to the mercenaries they encountered earlier, questioning why they seemed to be waiting for them in. As a result, Isabel recalls that the mercenaries mentioned they had been waiting for them for over a month, adding a new layer. Then, Luther notes that a month is roughly the same amount of time that has passed since they left Luanoble, suggesting a coordinated effort. Even so, Luther expresses his frustration, stating he cannot identify the culprit behind the attack, noting that the Aquareed family has many enemies. A flashback shows the menacing mercenaries with glowing red eyes, reinforcing Isabel's point about their formidable nature and the power behind them. As a result, Isabel acknowledges that despite the mercenaries' skill, Frey was able to defeat them with ease, highlighting his overwhelming strength. Even so, Isabel directly asks Frey how he acquired such immense skills and power, clearly impressed by his capabilities. Meanwhile, Isabel admits that she previously held a low opinion of magicians, viewing them as weak, but Frey's actions have completely changed her perspective. As a result, Frey gives a simple, slightly cryptic answer to Isabel's question about his power, attributing it to effort. Then, Isabel is left speechless and stunned by Frey's blunt response, while the story transitions to the harbor at sunset. Even so, workers at the harbor help unload the cart containing the bodies of the fallen knights, preparing them for their final journey home. The nuns embrace each other in tears, mourning their fallen companions as they prepare to say their final goodbyes. The group stands on the pier, watching the ship sail away into the sunset, marking the end of their brief journey together. Then, Frey and Isabel stand together on the pier, watching the ship disappear into the horizon as the sun sets. Even so, Luther approaches Frey to express his sincere gratitude for his help, acknowledging that without him the bodies would not have been. Meanwhile, Frey responds with a polite and humble smile, stating that he is glad he could be of help, maintaining his composed demeanor. At this point, Frey bids farewell to Isabel and her companion, wishing them an enjoyable journey. As a result, Isabel impulsively grabs Frey by the arm to stop him from leaving her expression intense and determined as she refuses. Then, Frey looks back, genuinely surprised and slightly flustered by Isabel's sudden physical intervention. Even so, Isabel insists on returning the favor for his help, her face flushed with a mix of gratitude and stubbornness. Meanwhile, Frey smiles warmly and dismisses her offer, explaining that people should help each other to survive, showing his pragmatic yet kind nature. At this point, Luther, the large knight, steps in with a serious expression, pleading with Frey to let them repay him, citing that. As a result, Frey scratches his head, looking slightly awkward and troubled by the persistent insistence of the group to reward him. Meanwhile, Frey relents and suggests they buy him dinner, specifically mentioning a place that serves delicious sausages as the sun sets over the town. The interior of the pub is filled with rough-looking patrons drinking and eating. A silver-haired man with a calm, confident demeanor replies that run-down, dirty places often serve the best food. As the pressure continues, the pub owner, an older man with a kind face, approaches the group carrying a tray of food and drinks. The silver-haired man smiles knowingly, his eyes closed in a moment of quiet satisfaction or amusement as he acknowledges the owner's greeting. The silver-haired man gestures toward the group, informing the owner that there is one more person who has returned alive, drawing the owners. As the pressure continues, the pub owner's eye shows a sudden intense reaction of shock or recognition, his pupil dilating as he processes. A red-haired woman and a battered, injured man stand together. The pub owner drops his tray in shock, causing food and drinks to crash to the floor. As the pressure continues, the injured man, seeing the pub owner's reaction, calls out "Father," revealing that the pub owner is his parent. The pub owner begins to wrap bandages around the injured man's arms, his hands trembling slightly as he tends to his son's wounds. The silver-haired man explains that Kazan was captured as a hostage while trying to protect a mother and her daughter, providing context for. As the pressure continues, the pub owner, weeping, embraces his son. Meanwhile, Kazan, still crying, apologizes to his father for his past behavior, expressing deep regret for yelling and leaving home. The red-haired woman watches the emotional reunion with a gentle, understanding expression, clearly moved by the reconciliation between father and son. As the pressure continues, the red-haired woman asks the silver-haired man how he knew Kazan was the owner's son. The red-haired woman reacts with visible anger and annoyance, her face flushing as she demands to know why he is calling her a drag. As the pressure continues, the silver-haired man dismisses the argument with a casual "anyways," while the red-haired woman remains visibly fuming in the background. The bearded man in armor remarks that the pub must be good since it is so busy, but acknowledges that they will have. The pub owner apologizes to the bearded man Sir Luther for bringing them all the way there, noting that the sausages are delicious. Even so, suddenly the pub owner shouts at the patrons to stop eating and leave immediately, his tone harsh and urgent, surprising everyone. The pub owner's face shows him looking intense and serious, as he reiterates that the pub is closed for the day, leaving no. As the pressure continues, the patrons are outraged, shouting at the owner and demanding to know why he is closing so early. The pub owner forcefully kicks the patrons out, telling them he won't make them pay for their meals, just to get them out. The heavy wooden door of the pub is slammed shut and locked, signaling that the establishment is now officially closed to the public. Meanwhile, Frey, with his long gray hair, smiles confidently and tells the group that he will use his skills to prepare everything. A view through a barred window shows the night sky with a full moon, suggesting that it is late at night. A woman with short blue hair is seen relaxing in a steaming bath, with the moonlight streaming through the barred window above her. A hand reaching out from the steam of the bath. The woman with short blue hair continues to bathe, her expression calm and contemplative as she moves her hand through the water. The pub owner serves a large platter of food to the bearded man and the woman with red hair who are seated at. The woman with short blue hair walks down the stairs, looking refreshed and clean. As a result, Frey greets the woman with short blue hair, telling her that he has already started eating without her. Even so, Frey asks the woman with short blue hair what is wrong and tells her to sit down. Meanwhile, Frey looks at the woman with short blue hair, noting that her face is a bit red and asking if she is sick. As a result, Frey grabs the arm of the woman with short blue hair, his expression serious and concerned as he notices something. The woman with short blue hair's face, her expression one of shock and distress as she reacts to Frey's touch. Even so, Frey's face, his expression intense and focused as he looks at the woman with short blue hair. Meanwhile, Frey holds the arm of the woman with short blue hair, which is covered in numerous scars. The woman with short blue hair pulls her arm away from Frey, looking defensive and upset. As the pressure continues, the woman with short blue hair wraps her arms around herself, looking distressed and vulnerable. The woman with short blue hair's eye, which widens in surprise as she hears Frey's comment. Even so, Frey points at the woman with short blue hair, his expression one of admiration as he tells her that the scars. The woman with short blue hair's face, her expression one of surprise and slight embarrassment as she processes Frey's words. The woman with red hair laughs, appearing to be amused by the situation, while the woman with short blue hair looks on still. The woman with red hair and Frey look at the woman with short blue hair, both appearing surprised by her mention of the. Even so, Frey, the red-haired woman, and the blue-haired woman are gathered together. Meanwhile, Frey speaks about the blue-haired woman, identifying her as the daughter of the Aquareed house. The blue-haired woman reacts with shock and disbelief, shouting that she is the daughter of the Aquareed house and mentioning a fiancé while. The blue-haired woman stands in a state of shock, pointing at herself with a bewildered expression as a bird flies by in the. The red-haired woman explains that she and Frey were trainee friends of Peruan at the same academy, and that they learned about the. As the pressure continues, the group continues their conversation at the table. As a result, Frey appears in a close-up with his eyes closed, appearing to be in deep thought or reflecting on the situation. Then, under the moonlight, Frey looks up at the night sky and thinks about Peruan, calling him a lucky bastard for his engagement. A group of adventurers stands in a town square at dusk, preparing to part ways. At this point, Sonia, a red-haired woman with a backpack, smiles as she bids farewell to Frey. As a result, Frey listens intently as Sonia continues her farewell. Then, Sonia, with her blue-tinted hair, looks directly at Frey while asking about his future plans to visit the June house. Even so, Frey's eyes narrow slightly as he considers the question. Meanwhile, Frey agrees to visit and accepts the invitation. At this point, Sonia smiles warmly, her eyes closed in a genuine expression of happiness. The story shifts to a sunny forest path. Then, Frey and the red-haired woman are walking through the woods. The red-haired woman looks visibly frustrated and slightly embarrassed, her face flushed as she realizes her mistake. Meanwhile, Frey turns back, looking confused as he asks why she is making such a strange face. At this point, Frey stops walking and points ahead, telling the woman that they have arrived. They stand before a dark, ominous tower, looming under a stormy, purple-black sky. The woman stares at the tower with wide, fearful eyes. As the pressure continues, the scene reveals the surrounding area, known as the Drake Mountain. A large, menacing drake flying through the dark sky. The woman is visibly shaken, asking Frey if they are really expected to fight the creatures inside the dungeon. As a result, Frey's hand appears in a close-up, clenching tightly. Then, Frey and the woman stand together, looking down at the ground. They look down at a massive, cracked footprint in the earth. The woman falls backward in shock, her expression one of pure disbelief and terror at the scale of the threat they are facing. She continues to express her disbelief, stating that she has never heard of a drake of such immense size. As a result, Frey tells her to get her thoughts together, reminding her that they are in the Hispania Mountains, a place where. Then, Frey holds out his hand, which is glowing with magical energy. The woman looks at Frey's glowing hand, confused and asking what he is doing. Meanwhile, Frey suddenly manifests a magical portal, and the woman is caught off guard, crying out in surprise as she is affected by a massive, hulking creature, the Drake King, crashes down onto the ground, creating a powerful shockwave. As a result, Frey leaps away to avoid the impact while the woman is left scrambling on the ground trying to regain her. The woman looks up, furious and terrified, asking Frey why he did that. As the pressure continues, the massive Drake King looms over them, its presence overwhelming. The red-haired woman stares in shock and terror, her eyes wide as she identifies the threat before them as an ogre. At this point, Frey looks on with a calm, slightly annoyed expression, thinking to himself that the woman could have just told him. A close-up reveals the terrifying appearance of the mutant ogre, which has bloodshot red skin and 3 eyes, one of which glows with. Then, Frey smiles confidently, noting that the master was correct about mutants appearing everywhere in these mountains. The mutant ogre's face appears in detail, its teeth jagged and its expression feral as it drools, emphasizing its monstrous nature. As the pressure continues, the ogre charges forward, brandishing a massive tree trunk as a weapon, while the woman prepares to defend herself. The woman channels magical energy, her hands glowing as she prepares to cast a spell against the charging ogre. As the pressure continues, the woman unleashes a powerful fireball, the flames swirling intensely around her as she shouts the spell name. The fireball strikes the ogre with a massive explosion, filling the air with smoke and debris. Even so, Frey watches the aftermath of the explosion, observing that the woman has become much stronger than he initially anticipated. The smoke from the fireball begins to clear, revealing the silhouette of the ogre still standing within the flames. As the pressure continues, the ogre's glowing purple eye pierces through the smoke, showing that it remains unharmed by the fire magic. The ogre roars in defiance, completely unaffected by the fire attack, its massive form looming over the battlefield. As the pressure continues, the woman panics, realizing her fire magic had no effect on the creature, while Frey observes her confusion. Even so, Frey explains that the ogre likely evolved to have high resistance to fire magic due to the presence of drakes in. The woman asks Frey what they should do now that their primary attack failed, looking up at the towering ogre. At this point, Frey asks if she has any ideas, as magical energy begins to crackle and manifest around them. As a result, Frey suggests that if fire is ineffective, she should try a different element, as magical ice begins to form. A complex magical circle appears, glowing with intense blue light as ice magic is summoned. Even so, Frey stands amidst the swirling ice magic, calmly instructing the woman to use ice against the mutant.